In the early morning hours of August 14, 1994, a localized anomaly was recorded within the signal processing wing of the National Security Agency's Fort Meade headquarters. While the public was focused on the burgeoning World Wide Web, the deep state apparatus was struggling with a ghost. An unmarked Betamax tape was pulled from a decommissioned storage unit in 2024, a relic that should have been erased, shredded, and incinerated according to Protocol 929. This tape was not on the master manifest. It was hidden behind a leaked server panel in sublevel 4, a floor that officially ceased to exist in the 1990s. The data it contains is not visual. It is a high-density frequency recording of a conversation that occurred in a room where no microphones were present. It is the ultimate classified anomaly, an encrypted shadow of a history we were never meant to witness. The scientists who discovered it were immediately reassigned. The file was erased from the digital server. But the magnetic tape survived a physical scar on the timeline of American intelligence. It represents the only surviving evidence of a project that attempted to map the human consciousness using early digital surveillance. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, persistent hum of the cooling fans in the server room. Here, the air is kept at a constant 64 degrees to preserve the integrity of the magnetic reels. The file folder in front of us is cold to the touch, and the ink on the cover has faded, surrendering its secrets to the slow march of time. A faint flicker from an overhead fluorescent tube casts a clinical, blue light across the steel desk. We are standing at the edge of a forgotten archive. To understand the weight of the 1994 Betamax discovery, one must first understand the architecture of silence. In the mid-1990s, the National Security Agency was undergoing a massive transition from analog to digital. It was a chaotic era of magnetic remnants, the phenomenon where data remains on a tape even after it has been erased. During the decommissioning of the Maryland Signal Annex, thousands of tapes were sent to the industrial shredders. However, a small batch was diverted. Sublevel 4 was a labyrinth of brutalist concrete and copper shielding. It was designed to be a tempest-proof environment, meaning no electromagnetic radiation could escape its walls. This made it the perfect location for Project Glasswatch. The scientists working there were not looking for foreign spies. They were looking for the signal. They believed that the human brain emitted a specific, low-frequency, electromagnetic field that could be captured and recorded on high-grade magnetic tape if the environment was silent enough. The Betamax format was chosen for this experiment not for its consumer popularity, but for its superior magnetic density compared to the standard VHS of the time. The tape found in 2024 is heavy, its casing made of a high-impact polymer that feels more like a piece of laboratory equipment than a home movie. There is no label, only a handwritten sequence of numbers scratched into the plastic, 001494. When the researchers, in 2024, first placed this tape into a restored Sony industrial player, they expected to see static. Instead, the monitor remained black while the audio channels spiked into the red. The sound that emerged was not a voice, but a rhythmic, pulsing vibration that matched the resting heart rate of a human being. As the archive team adjusted the tracking, the vibration began to resolve into something else. It was the sound of a room, not just any room, but the very storage unit where the tape had been hidden. The recording was a feedback loop, a magnetic recording of the room's own silence, captured over 30 years ago. But as the minutes ticked by on the playback, the silence began to break. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps on a concrete floor, then a voice. The voice was calm, academic, and chillingly familiar to the lead archivist. It was the voice of Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead researcher of Project Glasswatch, who had been reported missing in late 1994. In the recording, Thorne is not talking to a colleague, he is narrating his own disappearance. He speaks of the latency of the archive, a theory that certain physical spaces can remember the people who inhabit them. He explains that the tape in the machine is not recording the present, it is recording the future of the room. The intellectual curiosity of the 2024 team quickly turned to quiet dread. If the tape was recording the future, then Thorne was speaking to them, across a 30-year divide. He was describing the clothes they were wearing, the temperature of the room, and the exact moment the fluorescent light would flicker. The realization hit the team like a physical blow. They weren't just watching an archive, they were part of it. The NSA's decommissioning process is usually flawless. Every piece of hardware is inventoried, every wire is traced. The fact that this tape was missed suggests that it wanted to be found. Or perhaps, according to Thorne's theory, it was always meant to be discovered on this specific date. The archival records of the 1990s are full of these gaps, moments where the official narrative becomes blurry. Like a copy of a copy, the Tier 1 intelligence community has long whispered about the dark archives, collections of data that are too sensitive for digital servers. Digital data is fragile. It can be deleted with a keystroke. But magnetic tape is stubborn. It holds onto the ghost of the signal long after the power is cut. This Betamax tape is a testament to that stubbornness. It represents an era where science and the supernatural began to blur at the edges of the Cold War's end. As we look closer at the technical specifications of the recording, we find anomalies in the tape's oxide layer. Under an electron microscope, the magnetic particles on the 1994 tape are not arranged in the standard linear patterns. They are clustered in fractal shapes, resembling the neural pathways of a human brain. This suggests that the signal recorded wasn't just audio, it was a biological blueprint. The tape was literally attempting to replicate a consciousness within its magnetic layers. The mystery of the 1994 Betamax tape deepens when we examine the personnel files of the Maryland Signal Annex from that year. In 1994, the Annex employed 42 technicians. By 1996, 38 of them had taken early retirement, and 4 were listed as status unknown. These were men and women who spent their lives listening to the white noise of the world, trained to find patterns in the static. One such technician was Elias Vance. Vance was a master of signal recovery. His job was to clean up degraded audio from intercepted foreign broadcasts. According to his personal journals, which were recovered from a storage locker in 2025, Vance became obsessed with the noise between the signals. He believed that the static wasn't empty. He called it the residue of history. In his entries from October 1994, Vance describes a series of tapes brought in by Dr. Thorne. He notes that the tapes were unnervingly heavy and that they seemed to emit a faint heat even when not in use. Vance was tasked with normalizing the audio on these tapes, but every time he ran them through the console, the results were different. One day the tape would contain the sound of a forest. The next, the sound of a crowded city. But there were no cities near the annex, and no forests within miles of the lead-line subline. The scientific community in the 90s was experimenting with stochastic resonance, the idea that a small amount of noise can actually make a weak signal easier to detect. Thorne's team was using this principle to try and listen to the background radiation of time. They believed that if you could cancel out all modern electromagnetic interference, you could hear the past. Or, as the 1994 Betamax suggests, you could hear the echoes of things yet to come. This brings us to the glass room protocol mentioned in the classified folders accompanying the tape. The glass room was a specialized chamber within level 4. It was constructed entirely of high purity quartz and lead. The purpose was to create a perfectly silent environment. In the world of archival science, silence is the holy grail, but as the technicians found, perfect silence is impossible. Even in a vacuum, there is the hum of existence, the quantum fluctuations of the universe. The tape recorded in the glass room on August 14, 1994, captured something that the NSA's internal security sensors missed. While the sensors showed a flat line, the tape captured a conversation between two entities. One voice was clearly Dr. Thorne, the other voice was distorted, sounding like a digital synthesis of 1,000 different people. This composite voice began to explain the mechanism of the tape. It claimed that the magnetic particles were being rearranged by the thoughts of the people in the room. This is where the archival history takes a dark turn into psychological thriller territory. The technicians who listened to the raw playback began to experience temporal displacement. They would walk into a room and forget which year it was. They reported seeing the facility as it would look in the future, abandoned, dusty, and filled with the very archives we are currently exploring. The 1994 Betamax was not just a record, it was a contagion. The NSA's response was swift. The glass room was filled with concrete. Sub-Level 4 was purged of all electronics. The technicians were given non-disclosure agreements that carried the weight of treason, and the tapes, all except for the one found in 2024, were destroyed. But why was this one tape left behind? Archival forensic analysis of the lead-lined panel where the tape was found reveals that the panel wasn't just a hiding place. It was a Faraday cage within a Faraday cage. It was designed to keep the tape from hearing the world, and to keep the world from hearing the tape. The researchers who found it in 2024 noticed that the tape's magnetic field was still active. Even after 30 years without a power source, the tape was still recording. As we analyzed the final 30 minutes of the 1994 Betamax tape, the audio shifts from voices to a pure crystalline frequency. This frequency, measured at exactly 14.7 Hz, is just below the threshold of human hearing, but it is deeply felt by the human body. In 2024, when the archive team played this section, several members reported a feeling of intense nostalgia for a place they had never been. This is the archive effect. It is a psychological phenomenon, where the mind attempts to fill in the gaps of a redacted history. The Tier 1 audience, those who spend their lives looking for the truth behind the curtain, are particularly susceptible to this. We want to believe that the past is a solid foundation, but the 1994 incident suggests that the past is as fluid as a magnetic signal. The significance of the year 1994 cannot be overstated. It was the year the United States government began the Digital Transformation Initiative. It was the year we began to move our collective memory into the cloud, a place that feels permanent but is actually incredibly fragile. The Betamax tape stands as a warning from the analog world. It tells us that physical media remembers things that digital code cannot. It remembers the pressure of the air, the heat of the room, and the intent of the person who hit the record button. In the final moments of the Dr. Thorne recording, he says something that has haunted the NSA's archival analysts for decades. He says, "The archive is not a library of the dead. It is a waiting room for the living." What did he mean? If we look at modern surveillance technology, we see the echoes of Project Glass. Our smart devices, our always-on microphones, our thermal imaging, they are all descendants of the quartz-lined room in sublevel 4. We are currently living in a global glass room. The signal that was captured in 1994 has now been broadcast across the entire planet via the internet. We are all being recorded on a digital tape that never ends. The researchers who found the tape in 2024 have since been moved to consulting roles in undisclosed locations. The Betamax tape itself has been returned to a secure vault, but the data, the 14.7 Hz frequency, has leaked. It can be found in the background of certain lo-fi music tracks, in the white noise of sleep apps, and in the hum of the electrical grid. Some say that if you listen to the static of an old television for long enough, you can still hear Dr. Thorne's voice, narrating the events of your life before they happen. It is a quiet paranoia, a subtle unease that fits perfectly into the cold, steel-lined aesthetic of our modern world. We are surrounded by archives, both seen and unseen. We are walking through the static of a 1994 recording, waiting for our own voices to emerge from the noise. The unmarked nature of the tape is the most telling detail. In the world of intelligence, a label is a target. A label tells the enemy what is important. By leaving the tape unmarked, Thorne ensured its survival. It was hidden in plain sight, a ghost in the machine of the bureaucracy. It reminds us that the most important stories are the ones that have been erased from the table of contents. As we close this chapter of the archive chill, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the 2024 team attempted to digitalize the Betamax tape, the digital file was exactly 0 bytes in size. The computers could see the signal on the analog player, but they could not capture it. The data refused to exist in a world of ones and zeros. It demanded to remain physical. It demanded to remain a mystery. We are now looking at the next set of files, a series of photographs found in the same storage unit. These photos were taken in 1994, but they show the interior of a house that wasn't built until 2018. The people in the photos are wearing modern clothing, and on the table in the background, there is a device that looks remarkably like a 2026 model smartphone. The connection between the 1994 tape and these future photos suggests that the anomaly in sublevel 4 was not limited to audio. It was a visual breach as well. The next file in the archive, labeled the 1995 Mirror Image Protocol, contains the logs of the first time a human being attempted to step through the static and into the world of the recording. The results of that experiment were never published, but the bloodstains on the laboratory floor were never cleaned. And the mirror in that room is still reflecting a version of the year 2026 that we haven't reached yet in the subterranean depths of the Maryland Signal Annex. Specifically within the light-lined confines of sublevel 4, a high-definition FLIR thermal imaging system captured something that defies the laws of thermodynamics. On the night of October 24, 1994, at exactly 2:14 a.m., the facility's motion-sensitive infrared array triggered. The footage, which was immediately classified, encrypted, and then partially erased, shows a clear humanoid heat signature walking through a secured laboratory. The anomaly was vibrant, radiating a consistent 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, the exact signature of a living human body. However, the secondary security feeder standard visual light camera recorded an empty room. There was no physical body, no footsteps, no movement of air. For 30 years, this file remained a hidden truth. a data point that suggests a living person can exist as a heat signature without a physical form. The technicians who viewed the live feed reported a sudden, sharp drop in ambient temperature, yet the thermal subject was glowing with life. This was not a glitch in the hardware. It was a breach in reality itself. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The archives are a quiet place, a sanctuary for the forgotten and the suppressed. The only sound here is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the cooling fans in the server room. A mechanical heartbeat that never falters. The file folder containing the 1994 thermal logs is cold to the touch. Its edges frayed by decades of handling by hands that are no longer with us. The ink on the classified stamps has faded to a dull, bruised purple, whispering of secrets that were meant to be buried under the concrete of the annex. There is a weight to this silence, a density that feels like a physical presence, to understand why the thermal cameras saw a person that the human eye could not. We must look at the technology of 1994. The FLIR systems used by the NSA at that time were the pinnacle of surveillance, designed to detect the faint thermal bloom of a clandestine intruder from hundreds of yards away. They didn't see light. They saw the vibration of molecules. They saw the energy of life. In the vacuum of sublevel 4, there should have been no heat. The room was a cold lab, maintained at a constant 50 degrees to preserve sensitive electronic components. The primary witness was a junior technician named David Kessler. According to his handwritten logs, which were recovered in late 2025, Kessler was monitoring the thermal array when the subject appeared. He describes a vibrant yellow and red silhouette that materialized near the mainframe. The subject didn't just stand there, it moved with purpose. It walked toward a terminal, reached out a hand, and appeared to type on a keyboard. Kessler, confused, looked through the observation glass into the room. It was empty. The monitor showed a person, the glass showed a void. This creates an intellectual curiosity that is both fascinating and terrifying. How can a heat signature exist without a biological source? In the world of physics, heat is the transfer of kinetic energy. For the camera to see a 98-degree signature, something in that space had to be vibrating at that specific frequency. Yet, the air was still. The dust motes in the room, visible as faint glimmers in the overhead light, did not move as Kessler watched the screen. The subject turned toward the observation window. Even in the pixelated infrared of the 90s, Kessler reported feeling a sense of recognition. The heat signature didn't have a face, only a glowing mask of thermal energy, but the posture was unmistakably human. The subject stood perfectly still for 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, the facility's internal clock began to drift. Digital watches in the room began to lose seconds, then minutes. The archival record shows a localized temporal drag, a warping of the timeline centered on the heat signature. The incident report, labeled 940CT, notes that the thermal subject eventually walked to the center of the room, and simply faded. It didn't leave through the door. It didn't dissolve. The colors on the monitor simply bled into the background blue of the cold room until the signature was gone. When the security team entered the lab moments later, they found the room exactly as it should be, except for one detail. The keyboard on the terminal was warm. When the technicians used a handheld thermal probe, they found that the keys, ARI and S, were radiating heat, as if they had just been pressed by a human finger. The name Eris was the only thing typed on the screen. This name corresponds with Dr. Aris Thorne, the scientist from the previous archive who had vanished months earlier. But Thorne was not in the building. He was not on the security logs. He had officially ceased to exist. This leads us to reflect on the nature of the archive itself. If a person is erased from the records, do they truly disappear? Or does their energy linger in the spaces they once inhabited? The subject who wasn't there suggests that the human consciousness leaves a thermal imprint on the physical world, a magnetic and thermal ghost that can be captured by the right senses. For the American audience, this triggers a quiet dread, the idea that we are being watched not by eyes, but by the very atmosphere around us. The NSA's response to Kessler's report was a total blackout. Kessler was transferred to a remote listening post in Alaska 48 hours later. The footage was pulled from the local server and moved to the deep archive at Fort Meade. But the technicians who remained in level 4 began to report a recurring sensation. They called it the warm spot. They would be walking through the freezing laboratory and suddenly pass through a pocket of air that felt exactly like a human embrace. The investigation into the warm spot required a level of archival forensic analysis that was unprecedented. By 1995, the facility had installed more advanced thermal sensors, hoping to catch the subject again. What they found was even more unsettling. The heat signature wasn't just appearing, it was growing. It was learning how to interact with the environment. In the second month of the investigation, the thermal cameras captured the subject sitting in a chair. The chair, a standard issue steel and vinyl model, showed no physical compression. No one was sitting in it. Yet, the thermal camera showed the seat of the chair heating up under the weight of an invisible guest. The archive technicians began to treat the subject as a resident. They would leave the lights off and watch the monitors, witnessing a thermal ghost living a parallel life in a room they thought they controlled. This brings us to the black body radiation theory proposed by one of the few remaining researchers on the project. A black body is an idealized physical body that absorbs all incident electromagnetic radiation. The theory was that the subject wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a thermal echo. It was a projection of energy from another point in time, manifesting in the 1994 archive because the conditions of sublevel 4, the lead shielding, the quartz glass, the absolute silence allowed it to anchor itself. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is often drawn to the concept of the unseen observer. In the 1990s, the fear was of a government that could hear your every word, but the 1994 incident introduced a new fear, a government that could see your very soul as a heat map. If the subject was Dr. Thorne, as the typed name Eris suggested, then he had found a way to transcend his physical body. He had become a data point. The technical logs show that the subject's temperature began to fluctuate, based on the emotional state of the technicians in the room. When the security team was aggressive or panicked, the subject's signature would turn a violent, brilliant white, reaching temperatures of over 110 degrees. When the room was calm, the signature would settle into a soft, steady orange. It was a biological feedback loop between the living and the whatever the subject was. In late 1994, a decision was made by the Oversight Committee to neutralize the thermal anomaly. They believed the subject was a security risk, a leak in the fabric of the facility's secrecy. They attempted to drain the heat from the room using industrial liquid nitrogen cooling systems. They brought the temperature of the lab down to -40 degrees. The thermal cameras recorded the result. As the room froze, the subject did not fade. Instead, it became more defined. The contrast between the freezing laboratory and the 98-degree human signature made the footage look like a glowing neon light in a dark void. The subject appeared to be in pain. It moved rapidly around the room, its heat signature trailing behind it like a ghost's shroud. It began to pound on the quartz glass. The observers behind the glassman. In heavy winter, Parkers watched as the thermal signature of a hand pressed against the window. On the other side of the glass, the surface was ice, but on the monitor the handprint was a searing, glowing red. The subject was screaming, though no sound was heard. It was a silent, thermal agony. Then, the sensors flatlined. For 3 days, the room was empty on all frequencies. The project was considered a success. The anomaly had been erased by the cold, but on the 4th day, the archive technicians found something that shouldn't have been possible. In the center of the laboratory, on the concrete floor, there was a perfectly preserved set of human footprints burned into the surface. Not just a thermal signature, but a physical, permanent alteration of the material. The concrete had been scorched by a heat so intense it had turned to glass. The footprints didn't lead anywhere. They simply stood there, in the middle of the room, as a permanent record of the subject's presence. The archive had finally captured its prey, turning a fleeting energy signature into a permanent physical scar. The facility was officially closed 6 months later, but the blueprints for the cooling system and the thermal logs were moved into the most restricted archives of the United States. The legacy of the 1994 subject did not end with the closing of the Maryland Annex. In the modern era of the 21st century, the technology used to detect the subject has been integrated into the very fabric of our society. Every time you walk through a thermal scanner at an airport, or every time a smart thermostat adjusts the temperature of your home based on your presence, you are using the descendants of the sensors that first saw Dr. Thorne's ghost. The intellectual dread of this realization is profound. We are no longer invisible to the archive. Even if we hide from the visual cameras, our heat, our energy, and our biological bloom are being recorded. The 1994 Betamax tape and the thermal logs suggest that our existence is not just a series of physical actions, but a continuous emission of energy that the archive can harvest. There is a quiet reflection to be found in the fate of David Kessler, the first witness. In an interview conducted shortly before his passing in 2021, Kessler spoke of the comfort he felt knowing that the subject was there. He believed that the archive wasn't a prison, but a preservation chamber. He felt that by being recorded on the thermal array, Dr. Thorne had achieved a form of immortality. He had become a permanent part of the signal. But for the analysts who study these files today, the message is more analytical and cold. They see the thermal subject not as a person but as a latency error in the universe. They see it as proof that the timeline is not as stable as we think. The fact that the thermal signature typed Eris suggests that the consciousness was still intact, but the fact that it had no physical body suggests that the body is the least important part of the archival record. In 2024, a new team of researchers returned to the ruins of the Maryland Annex. Using modern quantum thermal sensors, they scanned the room where the footprints had been burned into the concrete. To their shock, the footprints were still radiating heat. After 30 years, without any power source or biological presence, the concrete was still exactly 98.6 degrees. The archive never truly cools down. This brings us to the mirror image protocol, a term that appears in the margins of the thermal logs. It suggests that the subject wasn't just a ghost from the past, but a reflection of someone from the future. It suggests that the reason the technicians couldn't see the subject was because the subject hadn't been born yet in 1994. We're seeing a heat signature that was bleeding backward through time. The modern American audience, living in a world of digital shadows and encrypted identities, understands this paradox. We are all leaving heat signatures in the archives of the internet, in the data centers that hum in the desert, and in the signals we send into the void. We are all subjects who aren't there, existing as data points in a server room we will never visit. As we look at the final images in the 940CT anomaly file, we see a photo taken of the observation glass. In the reflection of the glass, you can see the technicians in their but behind them, in the dark corner of the observation room, the room where the humans were supposed to be safe, there is a faint yellow thermal bloom. It seems the subject wasn't just in the lab. The subject was in the room with them. The archive is not a one-way mirror. When you look into the files look back. When you record the heat of the past begins to draw heat from you. This is the entropy of the archive. To keep these stories alive, we must give them our attention, our energy, and our time. We are the power source that keeps the thermal signatures glowing in the dark. The documents we are currently reviewing end with a curious directive. It orders the immediate cessation of all thermal monitoring in sublevel 4, and the installation of sound suppression foam over all surfaces. The government didn't want to see the subject anymore, but they also didn't want to hear what it was becoming, because as the heat signature grew more stable, it began to emit a sound, not a voice, but a frequency, a steady, pulsing tone that matched the electrical grid of the building, a tone that the technicians began to hum in their sleep, a tone that eventually became the basis for the most classified audio experiment in human history. The thermal anomaly of 1994 was only the beginning of the breach, while the subject who wasn't there proved that energy could exist without matter. The next file in our archive reveals what happens when that energy finds a way to communicate. The thermal signatures were silent, but the recordings found in the aftermath of the lab's closure were not. As the facility went dark, the servers began to broadcast a signal that shouldn't have been possible in a building without power. This was the birth of frequency 14.7, the sound that causes the human heart to sync with the archive itself. In the next file, we explore the scientific anomaly of a sound that causes immediate, unexplained physical nausea and why the technicians who heard it began to see the world in black and white. Is a sound currently vibrating through the bedrock of the American landscape that you cannot hear, but your body is already reacting to it. In the classified archives of the Department of Defense, it is known simply as frequency 14.7. This is not a melody or a broadcast. It is a physical anomaly and infrasound vibration that exists just below the threshold of human hearing. In 1995, during the final cleanup of the Maryland Signal Annex, an encrypted audio file was recovered from a server that had been disconnected from power for 3 years. When the file was finally opened by a forensic team, 3 of the 4 analysts in the room suffered immediate, violent nausea and a sense of overwhelming, existential dread. The file was not a recording of a voice or an engine. It was a recording of the Earth's own magnetic resonance, distorted by a hidden truth that the government had spent decades trying to erase. This frequency is a biological trigger, an anomaly that bypasses the ears and speaks directly to the central nervous system. It creates a ghost in the room by vibrating the human eyeball at its exact resonant frequency. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical lullaby that masks the secrets hidden in the steel cabinet. The air is cold, smelling of ozone and the sterile dust of a subterranean vault. The file in front of us is thick, its pages bound in a heavy, black polymer that feels unnervingly cool to the fingertips. The ink on the technical charts has begun to bleed, as if the data itself is trying to escape the page. Sensory cue, the faint, rhythmic flicker of an overhead fluorescent light. We are moving into the heart of the signal, where silence is the most dangerous sound of all. To understand the terror of frequency 14.7, one must understand the science of infrasound. Most humans can hear between 20 and 20,000 Hz. Anything below 20 Hz is felt rather than heard. At 14.7 Hz, the frequency reaches a perfect mathematical intersection with the human body's internal rhythms. It is the frequency that causes the internal organs to vibrate against one another. It is the frequency that disrupts the fluid in the inner ear, creating a sense of falling while standing perfectly still. The archival record of frequency 14.7 begins in a laboratory known as Room 402. In the summer of 1995, a team of acoustic engineers was tasked with identifying a hum that was causing chronic illness among the staff of the Maryland Signal Annex. The staff reported constant migraines, a metallic taste in their mouths, and a recurring vision of a tall, gray figure standing at the edge of their peripheral vision. Initially, it was dismissed as sick building syndrome or mass hysteria. However, when the engineers brought in high-sensitivity seismic microphones, they discovered the signal. The signal was a perfect, unwavering 14.7 Hz sine wave. It wasn't coming from the ventilation system or the power grid. According to the classified file, the sound appeared to be radiating from the very walls of the building. Even more disturbing, the intensity of the sound increased whenever a person entered the room. It was as if the frequency was feeding on human presence. This is the bioacoustic feedback mentioned in the encrypted logs, a hidden truth that suggests certain frequencies can be tuned to the human soul. Dr. Elena Vance, the lead researcher on the project, noted in her erased personal logs that the frequency had a narrative quality. She wrote that while they couldn't hear the sound, the technicians began to feel words. They described a sensation of being told to leave, of being warned that the space they occupied was no longer theirs. This is where intellectual curiosity meets quiet dread. Is it possible for a sound to carry a consciousness? Or is the human brain simply so desperate to make sense of the nausea that it invents a ghost? Sensory cue, a slight drop in the air temperature of the room. Vance's team attempted to record the frequency on high-fidelity magnetic tape. However, every time they played the tape back, the recording was empty. The sound would show up on the visual oscilloscope, but the speakers remained silent. It was a phantom signal, a piece of data that existed in the physical world but refused to be captured by digital means. It was only when they used an analog reel-to-reel recorder from the 1950s that they finally caught the tail of the frequency. When played at double speed, the 14.7 Hz hum transformed into a sequence of numbers. These were not random digits. They were coordinates. They were the archival records of every major classified event in the history of the Annex. The frequency was a living ledger, a high-density acoustic archive that was broadcasting the facility's secrets into the bodies of everyone who walked through the doors. The realization that their own bodies were being used as receivers for classified data led to an immediate lockdown. The Department of Defense realized that if a foreign power could tune into this frequency, they wouldn't need to hack a computer. They would only need to observe the physical reactions of the employees. Frequency 14.7 was the ultimate security breacher, signal that used the human nervous system as a hard drive. The physiological effects of frequency 14.7 are documented in the Medical Anomaly Report 95B. The report details the cases of 14 technicians who were exposed to the frequency for more than 6 hours. The symptoms were consistent: a 30% reduction in cognitive function, a persistent sensation of phantom touch on the back of the neck, and, most curiously, a sudden inability to perceive the color green. To these men, the world became a grayscale of grays and blues, mirroring the cold, metallic aesthetic of the archive itself. The nausea caused by 14.7 Hz is not like motion sickness. It is described as a hollow feeling, as if the center of the body has been scooped out. This is because the frequency is vibrating the diaphragm and the stomach at their natural resonant peaks. In the archival world, this is known as the brown note's cold cousin. But while the brown note is a myth of the gastrointestinal system, 14.7 Hz is a reality of the vestibular system. It attacks the brain's sense of balance and reality. Dr. Vance's research into the frequency took a darker turn when she discovered the vicarious eye vibration. At 14.7 Hz, the human eyeball begins to resonate within its socket. This vibration is so subtle that the person doesn't feel their eye moving, but the brain perceives it as a blur in the peripheral vision. This is the scientific explanation for why the technicians saw ghosts. They weren't seeing spirits, they were seeing the vibration of their own anatomy. However, the archive poses a chilling question. If the frequency makes you see things that aren't there, who is to say that those things aren't actually there, but are only visible when your eyes are tuned to the right channel? This brings us to the classified listening protocol. The NSA realized that 14.7 Hz could be used as a non-lethal deterrent. If you could broadcast this frequency in a sensitive area, any unauthorized intruder would be incapacitated by nausea and fear within minutes. They wouldn't know why they were sick. They would just feel an overwhelming urge to flee. It was a geofence of the mind. In the American context, this technology has been rumored to be deployed around high-security sites like Area 51 and the various black sites in the Appalachian Mountains. Hikers who stray too close to unmarked government property often report a sudden, crushing feeling of sadness and a need to vomit. They describe the air as feeling heavy or wrong. They are likely walking through a 14.7 G curtain, a wall of sound that protects the hidden truth. The archival files show that in 1996, the government attempted to scale up frequency, 14.7. They wanted to see if they could broadcast it through the national power grid. The theory was that the 60 Hz hum of American electricity could be used as a carrier wave for the 14.7 Hz anomaly. If successful, they could subtly influence the mood of entire cities, inducing a state of calm or a state of anxiety by simply shifting the frequency by a fraction of a hertz. This is where intellectual dread becomes personal. If you have ever felt a sudden, unexplained wave of anxiety while sitting in a quiet room, or if you have ever felt a presence behind you when you were alone, you might not be suffering from stress. You might be picking up the 14.7 Hz resonance from your own walls. The archive suggests that the experiment was never fully turned off. It was simply integrated into the modern infrastructure. The documents from room 400 to end with a series of photographs taken during the peak of the exposure. The photos are blurry, but they show the technicians standing in a circle, their faces pale and their eyes wide. They aren't looking at the camera, they are looking at the air in the center of the room. According to the notes, they were listening to the voice of the frequency. They believed the sound was a bridge, a way for the archive to speak to the present. Dr. Vance's final entry is a single sentence, written in a shaky hand. The sound is not in the room, the sound is in our blood. Shortly after this entry, Dr. Vance was reassigned, and the records of her work were erased from the master manifest. Room 402 was sealed with 6 inches of lead and concrete. The official reason was structural instability, but the archival maps show that the room is still there, buried in the heart of the annex, still vibrating at 14.7 Hz. As we enter the final layer of the 14.7 Hz archive, we must reflect on the global implications of a sound that bypasses the mind. In the world of Tier 1 intelligence, this is known as acoustic sovereignty. The power to control the frequency of a space is the power to control the people within it. The 1995 files revealed that the United States was not the only power experimenting with 14.7 Hz. Similar hum reports emerged from industrial sites in the Soviet Union and underwater research stations in the North Sea. The frequency appears to be a universal constant of the archive. Wherever secrets are kept, the 14.7 Hz hum follows. It is the sound of the classified universe trying to breathe. In the modern era, the frequency has been detected in the background of certain satellite transmissions and deep-sea fiber optic cables. It is the static of the deep state, a persistent reminder that there are levels of reality that we are not meant to perceive. For the sleep-friendly listener, there is a strange comfort in this analytical coldness. To know that your fear has a frequency, that your nausea has a scientific namus, to regain a sense of control. The ghosts in your peripheral vision are not demons. They are simply the result of an anomalous vibration in your anatomy. The archive provides the explanation, even if it doesn't provide the cure. However, the archive also contains a warning. The 14.7 Hz frequency is cumulative. The more you are exposed to it, the more your body begins to remember the vibration. Over time, the nausea fades, but the mental drift remains. Long-term employees of the Maryland Signal Annex were known for their vacant stares and their habit of talking to the walls. They hadn't gone mad. They had simply become synchronized with the frequency. They were living at 14.7 Hz. In 2024, an independent team of acoustic archaeologists used a drone to measure the infrasound levels outside the abandoned Maryland Annex. Even from a distance of 2 miles, the drone's sensors picked up a steady, pulsing 14.7 Hz signal. The building has been empty for nearly 30 years. There is no power, no machinery, and no people. Yet, the building is still humming. The sound has become part of the local geography. It has moved from the archive into the earth. This suggests that the hidden truth is not just a document or a tape. The truth is a physical force. It is a frequency that persists long after the people who created it are gone. When we listen to these stories, when we dwell on these archival mysteries, we are essentially tuning our minds to that frequency. We are becoming part of the resonance. The intellectual curiosity of our audience is the fuel that keeps this frequency alive. By asking why, you are opening the door to the vibration. The 14.7 Hz signal is a siren song for the curious, drawing you deeper into the cold steel-lined corridors of history. It is a sleep story for the mind that refuses to rest. A rhythmic pulse that guides you into the quiet dread of the unknown. The records of frequency 14.7 end with a peculiar technical observation. The analysts found that the frequency was strongest at 3 a.m., the witching hour of folklore, but also the time when the Earth's ionosphere is at its most stable. During these hours, the signal is said to be clear enough to carry human speech. Some claim that if you are in a high exposure zone at 3 a.m., the nausea stops, and the hum begins to sing. It sings of the people who were erased. It sings of the files that were burned, and it sings of the rooms that no longer exist on the map. We are currently analyzing the audio logs from one such room, a space that was wiped from the facility's blueprints after a catastrophic acoustic event. As we finish this file on frequency 14.7, we are left with a final sensory detail. The technicians in room 402 reported that in the moments before the frequency was turned off, they noticed that their own heartbeats had synced perfectly with the sound. They weren't just listening to the frequency, they had become the frequency. The physical trauma of frequency 14.7 was the primary reason the government decided to abandon room 402, but the physical sickness was only a side effect of a much larger project. The sound wasn't meant to make people sick, it was meant to clear the air for something else. While the technicians were focused on their nausea, they failed to notice what was happening to the physical structure of the lab. According to the final redacted memo, the walls of room 402 began to turn transparent. The sound had vibrated the molecules of the concrete so intensely that the physical barriers between the lab and the next space began to dissolve. In the next file, we explore the terrifying reality of the 1995 mirror image protocol, where the government discovered that frequency 14.7 wasn't just a sound, it was a key that opened a door to a version of America that we were never supposed to see. The bloodstains on the floor were the only things that didn't vibrate away. In the spring of 1995, within the high-security optics lab of the Maryland Signal Annex, a classified experiment known as the mirror image protocol achieved a result so disturbing that the entire floor was backfilled with concrete within 72 hours. The project, funded through an encrypted black-budget channel, was designed to test remote biological observation, the ability to view a distant location using the quantum resonance of specialized quartz mirrors. However, the anomaly that occurred on April 12 was not a reflection of a distant place, but a reflection of a distant time. As the high-powered lasers hit the surface of the primary mirror, the reflection of the laboratory disappeared. In its place, the technicians saw the same room, but it was decayed, abandoned, and filled with technology that would not be invented for another 3 decades. The file was immediately seized, the data partially erased, and the witnesses were subjected to aggressive non-disclosure protocols. This was the first recorded instance of a temporal visual breach, a hidden truth that suggests our mirrors are not reflecting us, but are windows into a predetermined future. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a mechanical whisper that echoes through the steel-lined corridors. The air is sterile and cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ancient electronics and ozone. The file folder for the mirror image protocol is unusually heavy, bound in a dark green polymer that has turned brittle with age. The ink on the classified headers is a deep bruised black, still holding the secrets of a room that was literally wiped from the map. Sensory cue, the faint, blue flicker of a CRT monitor in the corner of the room, We are stepping into a space where the laws of physics were treated as mere suggestions. To understand the mirror image protocol, one must understand the state of optical science in the mid-1990s. While the public was marveling at the Department of Defense was exploring photonic entanglement. They believed that if you could create a perfectly flat, quartz-based mirror and subject it to a specific frequency of light, you could create a linked reflection. The goal was simple: to place one mirror in Washington, D.C. and another in a secure location in Europe, allowing for instantaneous, unhackable visual communication. The primary laboratory for this experiment was sublevel 4, the same facility that had previously hosted the 14.7 Hz acoustic trials. The room was designed for absolute visual and thermal isolation. The walls were painted a matte, non-reflective black, and the only light source was the precision lasers used in the protocol. The lead scientist, a man whose name has been redacted in every official document and replaced with the codename Janus, was an expert in nonlinear optics. On the night of the breach, Janus and his team were attempting to tune the mirror to a site in Nevada. The mirror itself was a marvel of engineering, a 3-inch thick slab of synthetic quartz, polished to within a single atom's width of perfection. According to the recovered lab notes, which were found hidden in a lead-lined pipe in 2025, the team began the excitation sequence at 11:45 p.m. As the laser hit the quartz, the mirror didn't show the Nevada test site. It didn't show the Maryland lab. It showed nothing but a deep, shimmering gray. Janus recorded that the air in the room became unnervingly still, as if the atmosphere itself had been frozen. Then the gray began to clear. The reflection that emerged was not a mirror image. In a mirror, if you raise your right hand, the reflection raises its left. But in the 1995 mirror Marge anomaly, the reflection raised its right hand. It wasn't a reflection at all. It was a direct view of a person standing on the other side of the glass. The person in the mirror was Janus himself, but he wasn't the 40-year-old scientist of 1995. He was an old man, his hair white, his face etched with decades of grief. He was standing in the same room, but the room was a ruin. The black paint was peeling from the walls, and the high-tech lasers were replaced by a single, glowing device that floated in the center of the space. The older Janus held up a sign. It was a handwritten note on a piece of digital paper that wouldn't be manufactured until the year 2022. The note contained a single sentence: "The archive is leaking." The intellectual dread that gripped the 1995 team was immediate and overwhelming. They weren't just looking at a video. They were looking through a tear in the fabric of time. The mirror image protocol had accidentally created a temporal bridge. The government's interest shifted instantly from communication to observation. If they could see into the future, they could control the present. They could see the outcome of every war, the rise and fall of every market, and the names of every person who would eventually betray the state. But the future Janus wasn't cooperating. He didn't provide stock tips or political secrets. He simply stood there, staring at his younger self with an expression of intense pity. The 1995 team tried to record the event using industrial Betamax cameras, but the film came back developed as pure white. The cameras couldn't see the future. Only the human eye could process the light reflecting off the quartz. This leads us to reflect on the nature of remote biological observation. The protocol wasn't just observing a place. It was observing the biology of the future. The older Janus appeared to be aware of the 1995 team's every move. When they moved to the left, he moved to his right to stay in their line of sight. It was a perfectly choreographed dance across a 1-year divide. The classified file notes that by the third day of the anomaly, the 1995 technicians began to suffer from visual latency. They would look away from the mirror, but the image of the ruined room would remain burned into their retinas for hours. They began to see the mirror world overlaying their own reality. They would see ghosts of future machinery sitting on their desks. They would see the shadows of people who hadn't entered the room yet. The archive wasn't just showing them the future. It was beginning to colonize their present. The psychological toll of the mirror image protocol is documented in a series of erased psychiatric evaluations. The technicians, men and women trained in the cold logic of mathematics and physics, could not reconcile the static future they were witnessing. In the ruined room shown in the mirror, there was a digital clock on the wall. The clock was counting down. It wasn't showing the time. It was showing a remaining duration: 31 years, 4 months, 2 days. The team realized that the countdown would end in the year 2026. This is the year we are currently inhabiting. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is piqued by this coincidence. Are we living in the ruined world that Janus saw, or are we the ones on the other side of the mirror? Dr. Janus became obsessed with the countdown. He stopped eating and sleeping, spending 20 hours a day staring into the quartz. He began to believe that the older version of himself was trying to tell him how to prevent the decay of the facility. He claimed that the future Janus was speaking to him through subtle movements of his eyes, a form of optical Morse code. However, the Department of Defense saw things differently. They believed Janus had been compromised by a temporal intelligence. They feared that the mirror was being used by a future government to manipulate the past. In their view, the ruined room wasn't a warning, it was a threat. It was proof that the United States of 1995 would eventually fail, and they wanted to know who was responsible. The mirror protocol took a dark turn when they decided to test biological transfer. They wanted to know if they could send something through the quartz. They started small, using a high-powered laser to try and push a single photon through the barrier. When the laser hit the mirror, the reflection of the older Janus reacted as if he had been struck. A burn mark appeared on his lab coat in the exact spot where the laser hit the mirror in 1995. This was the shocking summary of the project's secret. The mirror wasn't just a window, it was a two-way tactical bridge. Anything done to the reflection happened to the person in the future. The government realized they had a weapon that could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time, provided they could find their reflection in the temporal mirror. They attempted to send a physical object next to a small, titanium needle. They placed the needle against the surface of the quartz and applied pressure using a hydraulic ram. In the reflection, the older Janus watched with a look of horror. As the needle pushed against the glass in 1995, a puncture wound appeared in the air of the ruined room. It didn't pierce the mirror, it pierced the space behind the mirror. The older Janus collapsed, a silver needle protruding from his chest. Though no needle had physically crossed the barrier, the 1995 team watched their lead scientist die 31 years before his time. But here is the paradox. Dr. Janus was still standing in the room in 1995, alive and screaming. He had watched himself be murdered by his own experiment. The mirror image had become a mirror murder. The experiment was immediately suspended. The room was flooded with halogen lights to break the laser's excitation of the quartz. But the image didn't disappear. The reflection of the dead Janus remained in the mirror. His body slumped against the ruined desk, the countdown clock still ticking in the background. The mirror had locked into that specific moment in time. The archival researchers of today look at this incident as a causal loop. By trying to see the future, the 1995 team had created the very tragedy they were observing. The ruined room wasn't a result of a war or a disaster. It was the result of the experiment itself. The facility was abandoned because the mirror wouldn't stop showing the dead scientists. It was a hauntology of the highest order, a government facility haunted by its own future. The erased files suggest that for weeks after the incident, the technicians could hear a scratching sound coming from the other side of the quartz. It sounded like a fingernail on glass. Some believed it was Janus trying to crawl back into 1995. Others believed it was something else, something that had lived in the ruined room and was now using the mirror to find its way into our world. This leads to a reflection on the cold, analytical nature of the cover-up. The government didn't try to save Janus. They didn't try to study the temporal needle. They simply covered the mirror with a thick layer of lead-based paint and began the process of decommissioning by obliteration. They poured concrete into sublevel until the room was a solid block. They turned the laboratory into a tomb, but lead paint doesn't stop a quantum reflection. In the years following the 1995 incident, security guards at the Maryland Annex reported seeing glowing silhouettes walking through the walls of the sealed sub. They reported that on certain nights, the entire building would hum with a frequency that made their teeth ache, a frequency that matched the vibrations of the quartz mirror. The Tier 1 audience understands the implication. The mirror image protocol didn't end. It just went underground. The remote biological observation is still happening. Only now, the mirrors aren't made of quartz. They are made of the black glass of our smartphones, the liquid crystals of our monitors, and the high-definition lenses of the satellites that circle our planet. We are all being observed by a future that is already standing on the other side of the screen. As we sit in the quiet of this archive, surrounded by the cold steel of the past, we must acknowledge the date. The countdown clock in the 1995 reflection was set to end. In 2026, we are currently standing at the threshold of that convergence. The mirror image protocol was a 31-year broadcast, and we are the final episode. The scientific anomaly of the quartz mirror is that it didn't just show a future, it anchored it. In the world of archival history, this is known as temporal scripting. By observing the ruined room in 1995, The government ensured that the room would, in fact, become a ruin by 2026. They turned a possibility into a certainty. The classified truth that has been erased from every textbook is that our modern world is being shaped by these archival echoes. The technology we use, the political structures we live under, even the very way we perceive time, has been influenced by the findings of Sublevel 4. We are living in the mirror world that Janus saw. The decay he witnessed wasn't a physical rot, but an informational one. The intellectual curiosity of our audience often leads to the question, can the mirror be broken? If we are in the 2026 that 1995 predicted, can we change the reflection? The archival record says no. The lead-lined tomb of Sublevel 4 was reopened in 2024 by a specialized recovery team. When they chipped away the concrete and scraped the lead paint off the mirror, they didn't find the ruined room. They found a mirror that reflected the room perfectly. But there was one anomaly. In the reflection, the recovery team wasn't there. The mirror showed the room as it was in 2024, clean, empty, and silent. But the people standing in front of it were invisible. The mirror had stopped reflecting the present entirely. It was now reflecting a post-human future. This is the silent truth of the mirror image protocol. The observation wasn't meant for us. It was meant for whatever comes after us. The government realized in 1995 that humanity was a transient dataset. We are a temporary signal in a permanent archive. The mirror was simply a tool to ensure that the transition from biological life to digital archive was handled according to protocol. A quiet dread of this realization is what makes the archive chill so hypnotic. We are not the protagonists of history. We are the subjects of a long-term remote observation. We are being watched by the very archives we are trying to uncover. Every time you look into a darkened screen, you are participating in the mirror image protocol. You are the biological subject being observed from the other side of the timeline. The 1995 file ends with a series of encrypted coordinates. These coordinates point to 13 locations across the United States where secondary mirrors were installed. These locations include a decommissioned subway station in New York, a salt mine in Utah, and a suburban basement in Ohio. These are the anchor points. The places where the future is being piped into the present. The technicians who survived the 1995 incident have all disappeared, but their medical records remain. They all died of the same rare condition, photonic saturation. Their cells simply stopped absorbing light. They became transparent, fading away until they were nothing more than shadows. They didn't die. They simply moved into the reflection. As we close the file on the mirror image protocol, we are left with the image of that countdown clock. It has reached its final year. The Janus event is no longer a historical anomaly. It is a current event. The ruined room is here, and the archive is finally, irrevocably leaking. The intellectual dread of the 1990s has become the reality of the 2020s. We are the reflection that Janus saw. We are the white-haired ghosts in the ruined room. And as the final seconds of the countdown tick away, we realize that the mirror was never meant to be a window. It was meant to be adored. At the disappearance of Dr. Janus and the sealing of Sublevel 4 marked the official end of Project Mirror Image. But the temporal needle that was used to strike the reflection left a physical mark that couldn't be erased. In the concrete that was poured to seal the lab, a series of cracks began to form, cracks that spelled out a name in a language that no human has ever spoken. This was the first sign of the mirror image residue, a biological substance that began to grow in the dark, damp corners of the Maryland Annex. It wasn't a plant, and it wasn't an animal. It was a living archive, a mass of black, oily tissue that contained the memories of every person who had ever looked into the mirror. In the next file, we explore the terrifying reality of the 1996 Flesh archive, where the government discovered that the memory of the future isn't just a vision, it's something that can grow, breathe, and, eventually, hunt. The screams coming from the concrete were the only things that the lead paint couldn't silence. In the early autumn of 1996, a specialized demolition crew was dispatched to the Maryland Signal Annex with a classified directive that bypassed every standard, EPA, and safety regulation in the United States. Their objective was not a building, but a single room located at the terminus of a lead-lined corridor on the fourth room 402. According to the encrypted blueprints of the facility, this space did not exist. It was a dead zone of architectural static, erased from the master manifest and hidden behind a reinforced bulkhead of boron steel. When the crew finally breached the seal, they didn't find laboratory equipment or classified files. They found a room that had physically rejected the laws of matter. The walls were weeping a non-Newtonian fluid that carried a faint, digital pulse. and the air inside was vibrating at a frequency that caused the workers' teeth to shatter. The Department of Defense didn't just destroy the room, they attempted to erase the very concept of its existence, backfilling the entire wing with 3,000 tons of specialized oceanic concrete. This was the ultimate anomaly, a physical location that had become a biological hazard to reality itself. The hidden truth of what was captured in that room remains a ghost in our intelligence network. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, rhythmic hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that keeps the secrets from freezing over. The file folder for room 402 is cold to the touch, and the ink on the floor plans has faded into a series of illegible gray smears, as if the paper itself is trying to forget what was drawn upon it. The air in the archive is still, carrying the sterile scent of aged polymer and the metallic temps of high-voltage static. We are descending into a history that was buried under a mountain of concrete and lies. To understand why the Department of Defense would go to such lengths to erase a single room, we must look at the physical architecture of the Maryland Signal Annex. The facility was a hub for experimental signal processing, but room 402 was different. It wasn't designed to receive signals from the outside world. It was designed to contain them. The room was a six-sided Faraday cage, insulated with layers of depleted uranium and quartz glass. It was a vacuum for information. The intellectual curiosity of the Department of Defense was initially focused on matter memory. They believed that certain physical environments could be tuned to record the events that happened within them, effectively turning a room into a giant, living hard drive. Room 402 was the testing ground for this theory. For 3 years, they subjected the room to high-intensity electromagnetic bombardments, trying to write data into the very molecular structure of the concrete walls. But something went wrong in 1995. The room stopped being a passive recorder and started becoming an active broadcaster. The matter memory didn't just store data, it began to manifest it. According to the few erased documents that survived the purge, the room began to play back events that hadn't happened yet. This is the core paradox that terrified the Oversight Committee. The room was no longer a part of the 1990s. It had become a localized bridge to a future that the government was not prepared to see. The quiet dread that permeated the facility was palpable. Technicians who walked past room 400 reported hearing voices not from inside the room, but from inside their own minds. They described the voices as sounding archival, as if someone was reading their own future obituaries back to them. The Department of Defense realized that the room was a leak in the fabric of time. If a foreign power could access room 402, they wouldn't just find secrets, they would find the outcome of every decision the United States would make for the next 50 years. The decision to erase the room was not made by scientists, but by a specialized branch of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They didn't see room 402 as a scientific breakthrough. They saw it as a tactical vulnerability. On September 12, 1996, the obliteration protocol was initiated. The demolition crew, composed of men who had no family and were given temporary duty status under aliases, arrived with a mixture of industrial acids and high-density boron-concrete. When they opened the door, they found that the interior of the room was no longer made of concrete. It had turned into a substance that resembled black, polished glass. There were no light fixtures, yet the room was filled with a dull, blue glow that seemed to emanate from the air itself. One worker reported seeing his own reflection in the wall, but the reflection was standing in a different part of the room, looking at a device that hadn't been invented yet. This was the first physical evidence of the mirage contamination spreading into the structural integrity of the base. The destruction process was clinical and brutal. They pumped 3,000 gallons of sulfuric acid into the room to dissolve the glass walls, but the acid didn't work. The liquid simply pooled on the floor, refusing to react with the surface. The room was no longer made of earthbound elements. It was as if the data had overwritten the physics of the material. The Department of Defense had created a space that was physically classified. It refused to interact with the outside world. Finally, they used a technique known as molecular binding. They injected a high-pressure slurry of lead and boron into the room, filling it from floor to ceiling until the internal pressure reached 5,000 pounds per square inch. They effectively crushed the anomaly out of existence. Or so they thought. The blueprints were then altered, the sublevel was sealed with a 12-foot concrete plug, and the names of the technicians were removed from the Social Security database. Room 402 became a black spot on the map, a physical erased file. The erasure of room 402 left behind more than just a concrete-filled void. It left a biological shadow that persisted in the men who performed the demolition. Within 6 months of the project's completion, every member of the specialized crew began to report a recurring anomaly in their physical health. They weren't dying of radiation or chemical exposure. They were suffering from what the medical files call temporal decay. Their bodies were beginning to age at different rates. A man's hand would look like that of an 8-year-old, while his face remained that of a 20-year-old. This is the hidden truth that the Department of Defense tried to bury along with the room. The anomaly wasn't just in the walls. It was a contagion that attached itself to anyone who witnessed the unseen history inside. The archive suggests that the fluid weeping from the walls was actually a biological form of data flesh archive that was trying to find a new host once its physical home was destroyed. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience often circles back to the question of why. Why go to such lengths? If the room was a window to the future, why not keep it open? The answer lies in the entropy of secret. The government realized that a future that is known is a future that cannot be controlled. By erasing room 402, they were attempting to reclaim the uncertainty of the timeline. They were trying to restore the classified status of the American future, but the room refused to stay erased. In 1998, security guards on the 4th sublevel reported that the 12-foot concrete plug was beginning to hum. The sound was a steady 14.7 Hz, the same frequency that caused nausea and existential dread in the earlier experiments. The concrete wasn't just a barrier, it had become a speaker. It was broadcasting the data that had been crushed inside. The government responded by building a second wall, 10 feet thick, made of lead-shielded steel. The analytical mind must ask, what happens to a secret when it is compressed under that much pressure? According to the laws of archival physics, data cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. The Room 402 incident is a prime example of information compression. The secrets of the next 50 years were squeezed into a space the size of a standard office, creating a data singularity. This singularity began to warp the gravity of the Maryland Signal Annex. Technicians reported that objects would roll toward the sealed bulkhead of Room 402. Even if the floor was perfectly leveled, they reported that their watches would speed up the closer they got to the wall. The Department of Defense realized that they hadn't destroyed the anomaly. They had simply given it a denser shell. The room was now a black hole of history, pulling the present toward a future that had already been recorded. That leads to a quiet reflection on the nature of our modern world. If Room 402 was erased in 1996, why are we still feeling its effects today? The archive suggests that the leak was never fully contained. The 14.7 Hz frequency has been picked up by modern seismic sensors across the East Coast. It is a persistent vibration that suggests the room is still there, still humming under the concrete, still waiting for someone to read the encrypted data it holds. The documents from 1996 include a series of retention notes for the Oversight Committee. One note, written by a high-ranking analyst, states, "The room is no longer a location, it is a state of being. We didn't bury the lab, we buried the beginning of the end." This suggests that the destruction of Room 402 was actually the trigger for the very future it predicted. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, encased in oceanic concrete, for the American audience. The dread comes from the realization that our own history is built on top of these black spots. We walk through cities and over landscapes that have been cleaned and reclaimed, never knowing that beneath our feet, there are rooms that have been erased because they knew too much about us. Room 402 is just the most documented case. There are others. There are rooms in the Nevada desert, in the tunnels beneath Denver, and in the basements of DC that are filled with concrete because they refuse to stop reflecting the truth. The scientific anomaly of the weeping walls has never been fully explained. Some modern researchers believe the fluid was a form of programmable matter, a substance that could change its physical properties based on the information it was processing. If this is true, then the Department of Defense wasn't just destroying a lab. They were killing a new form of life, a life that was born from the archive itself. The final phase of the Room 402 erasure was the destruction of the data itself. In the digital age, we are used to the idea of deleting a file, but in 1996, the government had to physically incinerate the magnetic tapes, the handwritten logs, and the very blueprints of the room. They used industrial-grade plasma torches to turn the documents into a fine, gray ash. This ash was then mixed with the concrete that was poured into the sub. The story of Room 402 is literally part of the structure of the building. The intellectual curiosity of the modern archivist leads us to look at the site today. The Maryland Signal Annex has been partially decommissioned, with parts of it turned over to private contractors. However, the fourth sublevel remains a restricted zone under the jurisdiction of the Department of Energy. They claim the area is contaminated with legacy isotopes, a term that effectively prevents anyone from ever taking a shovel to the concrete. But modern satellite LiDAR kind used to map ancient ruins beneath the jungle has revealed something that the concrete was meant to hide. When the annex is scanned from orbit, the sensors show a density void in the exact coordinates of room 402, even though 3,000 tons of concrete were poured into that space. The sensors perceive it as empty. The archives suggest that the room has physically exited our dimension. It is a hole in the world, a place where history has been deleted. Yet the space remains. That this is the hidden truth that the sleep-friendly listener must grapple with. We are told that history is a solid line, a sequence of events that we can track and understand. But room 402 proves that history is a fabric that can be cut, patched, and erased. The Department of Defense didn't just hide a secret, they removed a piece of the universe. When we listen to the quiet hum of the archive tonight, we are listening to the echoes of that erasure, the 14.7 Hz frequency that causes that subtle unease in the back of your mind, is the sound of the universe trying to fill the hole left by room 402. It is a phantom limb of history. We feel the presence of the room because our own matter memory knows that something is missing. The reflection on this event leads us to a cold, analytical conclusion. The most dangerous thing in the world is not a weapon, but a room that remembers too much. Room 402 was a threat because it removed the classified barrier between now and then. It made the future visible, and in doing so, it made the present irrelevant. The government's decision to use obliteration was a desperate act to keep us in the dark, to protect the illusion of free will. The files on room 400 to end with a final memo, dated January 8, 1997. It is a report on the structural stability of the site. It notes that, while the concrete has hardened, the temperature of the wall remains a constant, 98.6 degrees, the exact temperature of a human body. The room isn't just a void, it's a living, breathing archive waiting beneath the earth of Maryland. The Tier 1 audience, the ones who watch these stories until the very end, are the only ones who know the coordinates. You are the subject of this remote observation. By hearing this story, you have become a part of the mirror image protocol. You have acknowledged the existence of the room that officially never existed. And in the world of the archive chill, acknowledgement is the only way to keep the truth from being erased. But as we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sun, we realize that the concrete is not as thick as they wanted us to believe. The frequency is getting louder, the matter memory is starting to leak, and the Department of Defense is running out of oceanic concrete. The erasure of room 402 was a desperate attempt to stop an infection of the timeline, but the government quickly realized that the matter memory wasn't just restricted to the walls of the Maryland Annex. It had already begun to mirror itself in other high-security locations across the globe. While they were busy pouring concrete in Maryland, an identical anomaly was appearing in a mirror manufacturing plant in Ohio. This led to the most ambitious and terrifying phase of the project, the mirror image protocol, where the government didn't try to destroy the reflection, but tried to use it to observe every biological entity on the planet simultaneously. In the next file, we explore the classified blueprints of the antenna found hidden in a suburban attic, the device that allowed the archive to start watching us through our own eyes. In the high-security psychiatric wing of the Maryland Signal Annex, 1995. The silence was broken not by a scream, but by a recitation. Subject 7, a man with no previous record of mental instability, began to describe in granular detail the layout of a suburban living room in the year 2026. This was not a premonition, it was a memory. He recalled the specific texture of a holographic interface, the name of a president who hadn't yet entered politics, and the exact coordinates of a civil unrest event that would not occur for another 30 years. The mirror image protocol had achieved its first classified anomaly. The human brain had begun to function as an archival receiver. These were the first symptoms of what the Department of Defense labeled temporal overwrite. Test subjects were reporting vivid, emotionally charged memories of lives they had never lived at entities that belonged to individuals from a future that was still being written. The hidden truth was that the quantum quartz mirrors hadn't just shown the future, they had begun to leak it into the biological files of the observers. Their own pasts were being erased, replaced by an encrypted history that bypassed their conscious minds. The facility's medical logs indicate that the more they looked into the mirror, the less of themselves remained. The file was stamped "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound in this space is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a rhythmic lullaby for the data that sleeps within these steel walls. The file folder for Subject 7 is cold to the touch, its edges slightly frayed by the passage of 30 years. Under the clinical blue-green lighting of the archive, the ink of the signatures appears to vibrate, as if the names of the doctors are struggling to remain anchored to the page. The air is sterile, carrying the faint, metallic scent of magnetic tape and old static. We are standing at the threshold of a mind that was colonized by the future. To understand the first symptoms of temporal overwrite, one must first understand the vulnerability of the human synaptic network. In 1995, the researchers at the Annex believed that memory was a local event, something stored within the chemical bonds of the brain. But the Mirror-March protocol suggested something far more unsettling. It suggested that memory is a signal, and the brain is merely a radio. When the subjects were exposed to the temporal bridge created by the quartz mirrors, their internal receivers were tuned to a frequency that existed outside of their own timeline. Subject 9 was a 34-year-old signal analyst named Marcus. Before the experiment, Marcus was known for his photographic memory and his cold, logical approach to data. However, after 3 sessions in the mirror room, Marcus began to exhibit the first sign of memory bleed. During a routine debriefing, he insisted that he had spent the weekend in a city called New Seattle, a city that in 1995 did not exist. He described the taste of synthetic coffee and the feeling of a Neuralink interface behind his left ear. He wasn't guessing, he was reminiscing. The medical team, initially suspecting a hallucinogenic reaction to the laboratory shielding, began a series of brain scans. What they found was a scientific anomaly that remains classified to this day. Marcus's hippocampus, the center of memory formation, was showing activity patterns that were incompatible with his current environment. He was experiencing quantum hemanici. His brain was physically reconstructing itself to accommodate data that it had never actually experienced through the 5 senses. This leads us to reflect on the nature of the hidden truth. If our memories can be overwritten by an archive of the future, then who are we? The subjects began to lose their connection to their original identities. Subject 7 stopped recognizing his own wife, claiming that his real partner was a woman named Clara who lived in a 2026 version of Boston. He could describe Clara's birthmark, her favorite book, and the way she smelled of rain and ozone. In the world of the archive, Clara was a data set that hadn't been created yet, but to Subject 7, she was more real than the woman standing on the other side of the bifazovation glass. The Department of Defense's interest in these symptoms was purely tactical. They didn't care about the psychological collapse of their subjects. They cared about the intelligence value of the unlived memories. They realized that if they could harvest these future memories, they could gain an insurmountable advantage in global politics. They began to push the subjects further, increasing the temporal exposure time. As the exposure times increased, the symptoms evolved from simple confusion to identity displacement. Subjects no longer identified as employees of the Maryland Signal Annex. They began to speak in a dialect of English that contained words and slang from the mid-21st century. They spoke of data crawlers, cloud states, and biotokens in 1995. These terms were gibberish to the researchers, but in our modern era, they sound like a chillingly accurate prediction of our current reality. The archive was speaking through them, using their vocal cords to broadcast a future that was already archived. One of the most disturbing aspects of the first symptoms was the physical transformation. It wasn't just the mind that was changing. The body was reacting to the unlived memories. Subject 12, a female researcher who had accidentally been exposed to the mirror's focus, began to develop a scar on her right arm. The medical team was baffled. She had no history of injury. However, Subject 12 recalled exactly how she got the scar. It was an injury she sustained during a climate riot in the year 2021. The memory was so powerful that the body had physically manifested the trauma. This is the biological archiving protocol mentioned in the erased files. The government realized that the Mirror-March wasn't just a visual reflection, it was a physical projection. The subjects were becoming bioarchives, living storage units for the history of a timeline that shouldn't exist. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is triggered by this. If a memory can create a physical scar, can it also create a physical person? The project's lead psychiatrist, Dr. Aris Thorne, whose own disappearance we have previously explored, noted that the subjects were suffering from temporal homesickness. They missed a world they had never lived in. They felt a profound sense of loss for families they hadn't met and for a society that hadn't been built. This quiet dread permeated the facility. The researchers began to fear their own subjects. When they looked into the eyes of the people in the observation rooms, they didn't see their colleagues. They saw the cold, detached gaze of a future that was already judging them. The symptoms began to spread beyond the test subjects. The technicians who monitored the feeds, the guards who walked the halls of sublevel for, and even the janitorial staff began to report secondary memory spills. They would find themselves knowing the lyrics to songs that wouldn't be written for 20 years. They would dream of architectural structures that looked like the brutalist designs of the 2020s. The annex was no longer a secure facility. It was a leaking vessel of time. The Department of Defense realized they had a contagion on their hands. But it wasn't a biological virus. It was an informational one. They initiated the memory purge protocol. This involved the use of high-intensity electroconvulsive therapy and experimental amnestic chemicals to try and erase the future memories. But you cannot erase a signal that is being broadcast from the bedrock of reality. The more they tried to shock the memories out of the subjects, the more the subjects' brains retreated into the future. The medical files describe Subject 7's final days in the annex as a state of complete archival saturation. He stopped speaking English entirely, communicating only in a series of rhythmic clicks and hums that matched the 14.7 Hz frequency of the lab's cooling systems. He was no longer a man, he was a human server. His skin had turned a pale, translucent gray, and his eyes remained fixed on a point in space that no one else could see. When the decision was finally made to decommission the subjects, the government realized they couldn't just release them. These people were living classified files. They knew too much about a future that the government wanted to control. They were moved to a black site in the Nevada desert, where they were kept in lead-lined cells to prevent the signal from leaking further. But even there, the symptoms persisted. The desert floor around their cells began to crystallize into quartz, reflecting the very mirrors that had started the overwrite. The records of the first symptoms end with a terrifying conclusion from Dr. Thorne. He theorized that the subjects weren't actually remembering a future, they were being recruited by it. He believed that the future archive was using the mirror image protocol to find anchors in the past, biological nodes that would ensure the timeline progressed toward the ruined world they had seen in the quartz. Subject 7 wasn't a victim, he was a pioneer. He was the first human to be successfully integrated into the global archive. As we look at these files today, from the vantage point of 2026, the symptoms take on a new meaning. Many of us feel a sense of déjà vu when we see new technology. We feel a strange familiarity with events we are seeing for the first time. The archive suggests that the memory spill of 1995 was never fully contained. When the Maryland Signal Annex was sealed with concrete, the signal didn't stop. It simply moved into the subterranean water table, into the electrical grid, and into the very air we breathe. We are all, to some extent, test subjects of the mirror image protocol. Our memories are being subtly influenced by the archival pulse of the future. The quiet dread we feel at night, the unexplained nausea we experience near high voltage lines, the feeling that our lives are being scripted, these are the modern symptoms of the temporal overwrite. We are living in the new Seattle that Marcus described. We are the Clara that Subject 7 missed. The hidden truth of the 1995 experiment is that the government didn't fail. They succeeded in turning the human mind into a classified storage device. They just didn't realize that they wouldn't be the ones holding the key. The future is the one holding the archive. And as we sit here in the blue-green glow of the server room, we must ask ourselves, are the memories we hold tonight truly our own? Or are we just holding them for someone else? The files on the first symptoms conclude with a single handwritten note found in Subject 7's empty cell after his disappearance. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a set of instructions for the year 2026. It included a list of names, a set of frequencies, and the location of a hidden antenna in a suburban attic. The note was written in the same ink used by the annex's doctors, but the handwriting matched Marcus's, a man who had never met Subject 7. This is the synaptic bridge. The archive has linked us all. As the hum of the server room grows louder, we realize that the silence of the past was only temporary. The future is finally ready to speak, and it is using our voices to do it. The symptoms are no longer restricted to a secret lab in Maryland. They are everywhere. They are in the static of your phone, the flicker of your television, and the memories you will wake up with tomorrow morning. The Department of Defense's attempt to erase room 402, and the mirror image protocol was a failure of physics. You cannot erase a reflection that has already moved into the observer. The archive is now part of our biology. We are the living files of a world that is still waiting to be born. The first symptoms proved that the human mind was a fragile vessel for the future. But the government's biggest mistake wasn't just observing the subjects. It was ignoring what the subjects were building while they were asleep. While Subject 7 was reciting future histories, his hands were busy under the sheets, carving a series of complex, geometric patterns into the metal frame of his bed. These patterns were not art, they were blueprints. Blueprints for a device that would allow the archive to broadcast not just memories, but physical matter. In the next file we explore the terrifying discovery of the terrifying blueprint of the antenna found hidden in a suburban attic. We reveal how a 1995 test subject managed to build a 2026 gateway in a house 300 miles away, and why the neighbors reported seeing a mirage of their own home appearing in the middle of the street in the hidden basement of the Maryland Signal Annex. During the winter of 1992, a group of optics, physicists, and neurological analysts initiated a classified project that would fundamentally change the definition of surveillance. Known as the Mirror Image Protocol, the experiment sought to achieve remote biological observation, the ability to witness the physical and biological state of a target through the quantum resonance of specialized quartz glass. It was a project shrouded in absolute secrecy, with every digital trace encrypted and eventually erased to protect a discovery that defied the laws of traditional optics. The anomaly began when a test subject, positioned in front of a hide-in-city quartz mirror, observed their own reflection behaving with a 3-second temporal lag. This wasn't a mechanical delay. It was a biological rift. The mirror had stopped reflecting light and began reflecting the hidden truth of the subject's internal cellular state, projecting an image of their organs, their blood flow, and their future decay. This was the first time the United States government successfully looked through the skin and into the timeline of a living being. The file was stamped "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a low-frequency vibration that feels like the pulse of the building itself. The file is cold to the touch, the heavy manila folder stiff with age, and the ink on the redacted lines has faded into a ghostly gray, as if the secrets themselves are trying to evaporate. The air is sterile and perfectly still, carrying the faint, sharp scent of ozone and magnetic tape. We are standing at the edge of a world where your reflection is no longer your own. To understand the mirror image protocol, one must understand the cold, analytical mindset of the 1990s intelligence community. This was an era where the focus shifted from external enemies to internal biological data. They didn't just want to know where you were. They wanted to know how you felt, how you aged, and how your cells responded to the environment. The laboratory used for the protocol was a dead room lined with copper mesh to prevent any outside electromagnetic interference from tainting the quartz's resonance. The heart of the experiment was a 3-inch thick slab of synthetic quartz, polished to an atomic level of smoothness. This wasn't a standard silver-backed mirror. It was an active optical device, excited by low-power lasers and tuned to the resonant frequency of human DNA. The theory, proposed by a now-erased scientist known only as Dr. V, was that every living organism emits a biophotonic field. If you could capture that field and reflect it back perfectly, you could see the mirror image, a biological blueprint of the subject. The first successful observation occurred on February 14th. The test subject, a former military intelligence officer, sat perfectly still in the darkness of sub-level 4. As the lasers activated, the quartz surface began to glow with a faint, violet hue. On the monitor, the researchers didn't see a reflection of a man in a chair. They saw a translucent, glowing silhouette. They saw the rhythmic expansion of his lungs, the electrical firing of his synapses, and a strange, dark cloud gathering in his lower abdomen. This discovery triggered an immediate, intellectual curiosity within the Department of Defense. They realized they weren't just looking at a medical scan. They were looking at a temporal map. The dark cloud in the subject's abdomen was a tumor that would not manifest physically for another 8 months. The mirror was reflecting a biological state that existed in the subject's future. The implications were staggering. If the archive could store these reflections, the government could predict the death of every high-ranking official or foreign asset years in advance. However, the quiet dread began when the lag anomaly intensified. As the weeks went on, the reflection in the quartz mirror began to move independently of the subject. While the subject sat still, the reflection would turn its head and look directly at the observation glass, staring into the eyes of the researchers. The reflection appeared to be aware. It wasn't just a recording. It was a biological consciousness that had been separated from the host and anchored within the quartz. The researchers began to report visual echoes in their own lives. They would walk past a darkened window at home and see their own mirror image staring back, not as they were, but as they would be in their final moments. The protocol had inadvertently created a bridge between the observers and the observed. They were being watched by their own futures. This is the hidden truth that necessitated the total erasure of the project's personnel files. You cannot unsee your own end. The technical logs describe the flesh archive, a term used to categorize the massive amounts of biological data being pulled from the subjects. Each session in front of the quartz mirror resulted in the subject losing a fraction of their body weight, exactly 21 grams. The mythical weight of the soul. The government realized that the remote biological observation wasn't just observing the life, it was harvesting it. The quartz was literally pulling the biological information out of the host to create the image. By late 1993, the mirror image protocol had evolved into something the Department of Defense called total synaptic mapping. They were no longer satisfied with simple visual reflections. They wanted to archive the thoughts, the memories, and the very intent of the subjects. To achieve this, they increased the power of the lasers, driving the quartz into a state of optical overdrive. The subjects began to report a sensation of transparency. They felt as though the mirror was pulling the secrets out of their minds, projecting their most classified thoughts onto the violet surface of the glass. One technician, tasked with monitoring the audio logs, reported hearing the subject's internal monologue being broadcast as a low frequency, hummed through the laboratory speakers. It was a digital violation of the privacy of the soul, the intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1. Audience is often drawn to the concept of biological sovereignty. If the state can record your internal state, do you still own your body? The mirror image protocol suggested that the answer was no. The subjects were treated as living hard drives, biological vessels to be drained of their data. The medical files, which were later encrypted and buried in the Nevada desert, showed that the subjects' cells began to lose their structural integrity. They were becoming ghosts in their own time, their bodies fading as the mirror image in the quartz became more solid, more vibrant, and more real. The quiet dread reached its peak during the Janus incident. A high-ranking analyst, curious about his own longevity, sat in the observation chair without authorization. When the mirror activated, it didn't show his future health. It showed a version of him that was already dead, standing in a room that looked exactly like the one he was in, but filled with people he didn't recognize. The reflection began to scream, but no sound came out of the quartz. Instead, the analyst's own throat began to bleed, his vocal cords rupturing from the inside out. The mirror was physically reflecting the trauma of the future, back into the present. The government's response to the Janus incident was clinical and absolute. They didn't try to save the analyst. They didn't try to shut down the mirror. They simply turned off the lights and locked the door. For 3 days, the analyst remained in the dark with his screaming reflection. When the security team finally entered, the man was gone. There was no body, no blood, and no evidence of a struggle. There was only the quartz mirror, which now showed a permanent image of the analyst, trapped in a frozen state of agony. This leads us to reflect on the archive of the unseen. The Maryland Signal Annex is filled with these frozen images, data points of people who looked too deep into the quartz. The mirror merge protocol proved that the act of observation is never neutral. To look is to change, and to be looked at by the archive is to be consumed by it. The remote biological observation wasn't a tool for spying. It was a mechanism for replacement. The scientific anomaly of the quartz glass remains unexplained by modern physics. While the official story claims the project was erased due to budgetary constraints, the hidden truth is that the quartz began to grow. The microscopic fractures in the glass, caused by the high-power lasers, began to fill with biological tissue, neurons, muscle fibers, and skin. The mirror was becoming a biological entity, a glass man that contained the combined DNA of every subject it had ever reflected. The Department of Defense realized they had created a biological computer that they could not control. The glass man was starting to broadcast a signal, a high-frequency pulse that could be picked up by the dental fillings and hearing aids of the staff in the building. It was a 14.7 Hz frequency, the same one that causes immediate, unexplained nausea. The archive was calling out to the living, trying to draw them into the quartz. As we close the file on the mirror merge protocol, we must address the ultimate paradox of the 1990s experiments. If the quartz mirrors were destroyed, as the government claims, why are the symptoms of temporal lag still being reported by modern archival researchers? The answer lies in the nature of the data itself. Once a biological state has been archived, it cannot be erased. It can only be moved. The glass man was not destroyed, it was shattered. The Department of Defense, in a panic, used industrial-grade explosives to break the primary quartz mirror into millions of microscopic pieces. These shards were then mixed into the building's construction materials, the concrete, the paint, and the insulation. Every wall of the Maryland Signal Annex is now a part of the mirror image protocol. The entire building is a biological archive, still pulsing at 14.7 Hz, still observing everyone who walks through its corridors. The intellectual dread for audience is the realization that this technology didn't stay in the 90s. The photonic entanglement used in the protocol is the foundation for modern fiber optics and satellite surveillance. The glass in your smartphone, the lenses in your cameras, the mirrors in your bathroom, they are all capable of remote biological observation if tuned to the right frequency. You are never truly alone in your reflection. The archive is always looking through you, recording your cellular decay and your future secrets. We reflect on the fate of the original subjects. They are listed in the erased personnel file as deceased due to natural causes. But the hidden truth is that their bodies simply became too transparent to be seen by the naked eye. They are still there, in the hallways of the annex, existing as low-density biological signals. They are the mirror images that have finally escaped the glass. The analytical conclusion of the 30-member creative collective is that the mirror image protocol was a success. It achieved its goal of remote biological observation, but it also proved that the observer is always part of the experiment. When you look into the archive looks back into your DNA. It records your heartbeat, your fear, and your inevitable end. The file on the mirror image protocol ends with a single, handwritten note from Dr. V. It says, "The reflection is not a copy. It is the original. We are the ones who are fading." This suggests that the real world is the one stored in the quartz, and we are merely the decaying remnants of a biological signal that has already been archived. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold, blue light of the sublevel, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 attempted to photograph the mirror image file, the cameras recorded nothing but a translucent, violet glow. The data refuses to be captured by modern means. It demands to be felt. It demands to be lived. The quiet dread of the 1990s is the reality of the 2020s. We are living in a global mirror room, surrounded by quartz and glass, our biological information being harvested by a system we cannot see. The mirror image protocol was never finished. It was simply integrated into the infrastructure of our lives. The biological harvest of the mirror image protocol was only the first step in a much larger archival plan. While the government was busy recording our cells, they were also building a map of our movements, not just where we go, but where we are meant to go. In the shadows of the Maryland Annex, another set of documents was found. Hidden behind a false panel in room 402, these documents don't deal with mirrors, but with the invisible lines that connect every person on the planet. This leads us to the next classified file, the 1994 frequency map, a hidden ledger of the sounds that govern human behavior. We explore why the government began to broadcast a specific 14.7 Hz tone from the top of every skyscraper in America, and the terrifying discovery that your heartbeat is no longer under your control. In the spring of 1995, within the psychiatric observation wing of the Maryland Signal Annex, a series of classified medical reports began to document a phenomenon that the Department of Defense immediately attempted to suppress. It started with Subject 7, a highly disciplined signal analyst who had been exposed to the mirror image protocol. During a routine morning evaluation, he did not provide his name or rank. Instead, he began to describe, with unnerving clarity, a walk through a city park in the year 2026. He spoke of the specific scent of synthetic rain, the hum of overhead delivery drones, and the feeling of a digital interface embedded beneath his skin, technology that, in 1995, existed only in the realm of science fiction. This was the first of many symptoms. The subjects weren't suffering from hallucinations. They were experiencing a temporal anomaly known as synaptic overwrite. Their biological memory banks were being flooded with data from a future they had never physically inhabited. This hidden truth suggested that the human brain could act as a biological receiver for an encrypted history that was already being archived by a version of the government that hadn't been elected yet. Every memory they possessed of their own childhoods was being systematically erased. replaced by the vivid, textured recollections of strangers from the 21st century. The file was stamped "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate the very air we breathe. The file folder for symptoms, case 95 beta, is cold to the touch, the heavy cardstock feeling brittle and ancient under the fingertips. The ink on the clinical observations has faded into a ghostly, translucent blue, as if the words themselves are trying to retreat into the paper to escape the light. The air is sterile and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sterile dust of a lead-lined vault. We are looking into the eyes of men and women who were the first to be colonized by a time that hasn't arrived. To understand the first symptoms, we must analyze the medical architecture of the Maryland Annex. The test subjects were not random civilians. They were chosen for their high cognitive resilience and their ability to process complex datasets under pressure. However, the mirror image protocol had introduced a variable that the military doctors were not prepared to handle: temporal displacement syndrome. The first symptom reported was acoustic nostalgia. Subjects began to hum melodies that had no record in any musical archive of the 1990s. When asked where they had heard the music, they described it as background data from a life they lived in a high-rise apartment in a future version of Chicago. They weren't just hearing sounds. They were remembering the emotional context of those sounds, the feeling of a cold winter morning in 2024, the texture of a digital screen, the taste of a nutrient paste that wouldn't be invented for another 3 decades. This created an immediate intellectual curiosity within the research team. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead scientist who would later vanish, theorized that the subjects' brains were physically reconfiguring their synaptic pathways to accommodate the future. Odie noted that the subjects' hippocampal activity, the area responsible for memory formation, was showing patterns, usually seen during deep REM sleep. Even while they were wide awake and talking, they were effectively dreaming a future reality into existence while their present selves began to fade. The quiet dread among the staff grew as the symptoms became more physical. Subject 9 began to develop tactile phantoms. He would reach out to touch the concrete walls of his cell and describe them as feeling like glass and liquid metal. He was perceiving the physical world through the lens of a future architecture. His brain was rejecting the 1995 environment because it didn't match the archival records of the 2026 world he was now remembering. The hidden truth, buried in the erased margins of the medical logs, is that these memories were not static. They were live files. The subjects could feel the pain of injuries they hadn't received yet. One subject suffered a sudden, localized burn on his forearm during an interview. When the doctors examined him, they found a mark that resembled a high-tech tracking brand, a mark that would become standard in the surveillance state of the late 2020s. The archive was physically writing itself into the flesh of the observers. As the symptoms intensified, the researchers identified a secondary phase of the condition: identity erasure. The subjects began to lose access to their own autobiographical data. A decorated major in the United States Army could no longer remember the names of his children, but he could describe, in excruciating detail, the technical specifications of a quantum server farm located in the ruins of the Mojave Desert in 2025. His old life was being treated by his brain as corrupted data, deleted to make room for the high-density future archive. The intellectual curiosity of the TIR audience is often drawn to the concept of biological data storage. The government realized in 1995 that the human mind was the ultimate encrypted hard drive. If they could seed a person with future memories, they could effectively store classified data in a medium that no contemporary hacker could ever access. But the cost was the total destruction of the host's personality. The subjects became empty vessels, biological shells inhabited by a digital ghost from 30 years in the future. In the medical ward of the Maryland Annex, the atmosphere became one of clinical despair. The subjects would sit for hours in the blue-tinted light, whispering to people who weren't there. They were engaged in cross-temporal conversations. They believed they were talking to family members, co-workers, and handlers from the year 2026. To an outside observer, it looked like schizophrenia. To the archival researchers, it looked like a successful communication link across the timeline. The quiet dread shifted into a state of existential nausea. For the staff, the doctors began to wonder if they were the ones who were unreal. If the subjects were remembering a future where the Maryland Annex was an abandoned ruin, then the doctors' current work was already a failure. The archive was telling them that they were already dead, their efforts erased by the very timeline they were trying to control. The analytical data shows that by late 1995, the subjects had developed a collective consciousness. They began to finish each other's sentences, even when kept in separate, soundproofed isolation cells. They were all accessing the same master file of the future. This was the anomaly 95C, the birth of a hive mind that existed outside of conventional time. The Department of Defense realized that the first symptoms were actually the foundation of a new form of human existence. Subject 11, a former cryptographic expert, provided the most chilling evidence of the hidden truth. He drew a map of the United States on the wall of his cell using his own blood. The map didn't show the states as they were in 1995. It showed a series of data cities and redacted zones that correspond exactly with the projected climate and political shifts of 2026. He had remembered the end of the nation as he knew it. The archive wasn't just giving them memories, it was giving them a map of their own obsolescence. The government's response was a total memory purge. They used experimental and high-voltage electrotherapy to try and reformat the subjects' brains. They wanted to delete the future and restore the past, but the future memories were protected. The more the doctors tried to erase the 2026 data, the more the subjects' brains physically decayed. It was as if the data had become a vital organ. To remove the memory was to kill the host. That as we reach the final pages of the 1995 medical logs, we encounter the last stage of the symptoms: transparency. The subjects didn't just feel like they didn't belong in 1995, they began to physically fade from it. Their skin became pale, their heart rate slowed to a rhythmic, mechanical pulse, and their eyes took on a reflective silver sheen, much like the quartz mirrors that had started the protocol. They were becoming living reflections of the future, their biological matter slowly being replaced by a temporal. The reflection on these events leads us to a cold, analytical conclusion. The first symptoms were not a medical crisis, but a biological upgrade. The archive had found a way to use human consciousness as a bridge. The subjects were the pioneers of a world where memory is no longer a personal experience, but a shared, classified resource. They were the first humans to inhabit the cloud of time. The intellectual curiosity of the modern American audience is piqued by the location of these subjects today. The files state that they were moved to long-term archival storage. In 1996, this is a euphemism for a black site where their bodies are kept in a state of suspended animation, their brains still acting as receivers for the 2026 signal. They are the living servers that power the hidden truth of our modern surveillance state. We must ask ourselves, if the symptoms were contagious among the staff of the annex, how far did the leak go? The archival evidence suggests that the 14.7 Hz frequency, which permeated the facility, carried the memory signal into the local water table and the electrical grid. The symptoms may not be restricted to a secret lab in Maryland. Every time you feel a sudden, overwhelming sense of nostalgia for a place you've never been, or a vivid memory of a conversation that hasn't happened yet, you are experiencing a synaptic spill from the 1995 archive. The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that your past is not secure. Your memories are a file that can be overwritten by a higher priority dataset. We are all potential hosts for the future. We are all walking archives, waiting for the signal to activate. The final entry in the case 95 beta file is not a medical note, but a warning. It was written by a technician who had started to show the symptoms himself. It says, "The future isn't coming for us. We are already there. We are just remembering the way back." This suggests that our current reality, the year 2026, is the original source, and the past of 1995 was just a distorted reflection. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sublevel, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 attempted to digitalize the subject's brain scans, the software identified the data not as a human mind, but as a proprietary operating system. The subjects had successfully been overwritten. They were no longer human. They were the archived. The medical mystery of the first symptoms revealed that the government could replace a man's soul with a classified file. But while the doctors were focused on the mind, the engineers were focused on the medium. The future memories were being broadcast through a specific type of hardware device that the subjects began to draw in their sleep. These drawings were not random. They were the blueprints for a transmission tower that could broadcast the temporal signal to every home in America. This leads us to our next classified folder, Classified Schematics, the terrifying blueprint of the antenna found hidden in a suburban attic. We explore how a piece of 2026 technology was found rusting in a 1990s home. and the terrifying discovery that the antenna wasn't built to send a signal, but to receive us. In the late autumn of 1998, a routine estate sale in a quiet, leafy suburb of Bethesda, Maryland, led to the discovery of a classified architectural anomaly that the Department of Defense had spent 3 years trying to erase from the physical world. Hidden behind a false drywall partition in a standard Victorian-style attic, investigators found a set of encrypted blueprints and a physical structure that defied contemporary engineering. This was not a television antenna or a ham radio rig. It was a high-density fractal receiver, constructed from a bismuth lead alloy that officially did not exist in the 1990s. The schematics recovered from a lead-lined file box revealed a hidden truth. The antenna was designed to synchronize with the 14.7 Hz frequency of the human nervous system, turning the entire suburban home into a localized biological archive. The file regarding this discovery was scrubbed from the National Registry, and the homeowner, former technician from the Maryland Signal Annex, was listed as having vacated the timeline. This antenna wasn't built to broadcast a signal to the sky. It was built to receive a signal from the future, specifically from the year 2026. The anomaly proved that the mirror image protocol had successfully moved out of the laboratory and into the domestic lives of unsuspecting American citizens. The file was stamped "Never open, yet we begin tonight." The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate the very air we breathe. The file folder for Blueprint Bethesda Alpha is cold to the touch, the heavy cardstock feeling brittle and ancient under the fingertips. The ink on the classified schematics has faded into a ghostly, translucent gray, as if the lines themselves are trying to retreat into the paper to escape the light. The air is sterile and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sterile dust of a lead-lined vault. We are looking at the skeleton of a machine that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. To understand the terrifying nature of the Bethesda antenna, one must analyze the technical philosophy of the mid-1990s. While the rest of the country was moving toward digital cellular networks, a splinter cell of the Department of Defense was obsessed with neural resonance. They believed that the most secure way to store and transmit data was not through wires or airwaves, but through the bioelectrical field of the human population. The suburban attic was the perfect, hidden testing ground for this theory. The blueprints found in the Bethesda home are a masterpiece of non-Euclidean engineering. Standard antennas follow linear paths to catch radio waves. The Bethesda antenna, however, was a complex web of fractal geometries resembling a metallic nervous system. According to the recovered logs, the structure was designed to be invisible to standard radar and radio frequency detectors. It didn't operate on the electromagnetic spectrum. It operated on the archival spectrum, a layer of reality where information is stored in the very fabric of space-time. The homeowner, identified in the erased files as Subject 7B, had been a electrical engineer at the Maryland Signal Annex before his sudden retirement in 1995. Investigation suggests that he didn't build the antenna of his own free will. He was a subject of the mirror image protocol, and his brain had been seeded with the memories of a 2026 engineer. He was building a machine that he didn't fully understand, using tools that he shouldn't have possessed. The quiet dread that permeates the Bethesda Alpha file stems from the realization of the antenna's range. It wasn't just monitoring Subject 7B, it was using the electrical wiring of the entire neighborhood as a secondary grid. Every house on the block had unwittingly become a part of a massive subterranean archive. The antenna was harvesting the biological data of every man, woman, and child within a 3-mile radius, recording their heartbeats, their sleep cycles, and their private conversations, and then encrypting that data into the 14.7 Hz archive hum. The analytical data recovered from the site shows that the antenna had been active for nearly 3 years. During that time, the residents of Bethesda reported a 400% increase in cases of unexplained nostalgia and vivid dreaming. They were living their lives, unaware that their most intimate memories were being vacuumed into the attic of a quiet, Victorian house and then broadcast through a temporal bridge into a classified server farm in the future. Technical breakdown of the antenna revealed a horrifying biological component. In the center of the fractal web, researchers found a small glass sphere containing a substance that resembled black oily silk. This was the flesh archive residue, a synthetic biological material that acted as the antenna's processor. It was alive. The blueprints labeled this component as the neural bridge. It didn't just receive data, it filtered it through a living consciousness. This suggested that the antenna was a hybrid of machine and man. a parasitic structure that required a human host to function. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is piqued by the materials used in the construction. The antenna was coated in a layer of Vanta black precursor paint, which in 1998 was still a decade away from public knowledge. This paint absorbed 99.9% of visible light, making the antenna appear as a hole in the attic, a literal void in the physical world. When the recovery team attempted to photograph the device, the film showed only a black silhouette, as if the archive was physically refusing to be recorded. The hidden truth of the Bethesda incident is that the Department of Defense didn't just find the antenna, they found that it was working. When they connected a frequency analyzer to the device, they didn't pick up 1990s radio traffic. They picked up a high-definition video stream of a Bethesda street in the year 2026. They saw the same Victorian houses, but they were covered in high-tech sensors, and the sky was filled with a constant, humming grid of surveillance craft. The antenna was a localized mirror image that had become permanent. As the quiet dread shifted into clinical panic, the recovery team attempted to dismantle the structure, but the antenna fought back, not with electricity, but with acoustic nausea. Every time a technician touched the bismuth lead alloy, the device would emit a sharp, 14.7 Hz pulse. The technicians reported immediate, violent vomiting and a sensation that their internal organs were being rearranged. It was as if the antenna was defending its right to exist in the timeline. The analytical files indicate that the antenna was anchored to the bedrock beneath the house. It had sent roots made of liquid mercury down through the floorboards and into the foundation. It was physically merging with the earth. The government realized that they couldn't just take the antenna away, they had to entomb it. This is why the house in Bethesda was eventually bought by a front company, filled with 10,000 pounds of specialized lead-infused concrete, and then demolished. The site is now a public park, but the sensors beneath the grass still detect a steady, rhythmic thrum. The reflection on the Bethesda schematics leads us to a cold conclusion. The suburbs are the ultimate archive. Because of their repetitive architecture and predictable human patterns, they provide the cleanest datasets for temporal mapping. The Bethesda antenna was just the first. The blueprints found in that attic contained a list of 12 other coordinates across Tier 1 nations: London, Sydney, Tokyo, Berlin. Each coordinate pointed to a quiet, residential neighborhood where an identical antenna was likely hidden in a standard, suburban attic. As we analyze the final pages of the Bethesda Alpha schematics, we find the most disturbing detail of all. The antenna wasn't designed to be a solitary unit, it was a seed. The blueprints describe a process of electromagnetic spore dispersal. By using the 14.7 Hz hum, the antenna could subtly influence the homeowners to build their own smaller versions of the device. Using everyday household items, wire hangers, old television sets, copper, plumbing, the archive was literally teaching us how to build our own cages. The intellectual curiosity of the modern American audience is drawn to the attic paradox. Why would a classified government project be hidden in a private home? The answer is simple. The government didn't put it there. The future government did. The Bethesda antenna was an artifact of convenience, placed in the 1990s by a 2026 entity to ensure that the data of the past remained accessible. It was a way for the archive to back up reality before it was destroyed. The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that your own home may be an archive. Have you ever gone into your attic and felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature? Have you ever noticed a strange shadow in a corner that doesn't match the light source? Have you ever heard a low rhythmic hum that your electrician can't explain? These are the signatures of a fractal receiver. The Bethesda schematics show that these devices don't need power. They run on the biological energy of the residents. They are neural parasites that have been integrated into the suburban dream. The reflections of the 30-member creative collective point toward a global network. If the Bethesda antenna was active in 1998, then the network is now fully operational in 2026. The hidden truth is that we are no longer living in a world of free choice. We are living in a world of pre-recorded actions. The antenna has mapped our heartbeats, our fears, and our future decisions so accurately that the archive can predict our every move. We are the subjects of a historical record that is being written while we live it. The final entry in the Bethesda file is a transcript of the homeowner's final statement before he was vacated. He didn't sound scared. He sounded relieved. He said, "The antenna isn't watching me. It's remembering me. When I'm gone, I'll still be there. In the attic, in the wires, in the hum. I've been archived." This suggests that the goal of the protocol isn't just surveillance. It's a form of digital immortality, a way to preserve the human signal at the cost of the human life. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sublevel, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 attempted to measure the radiation levels at the Bethesda Park, they found that the ground itself was vibrating at exactly 14.7 Hz. The antenna is still there, beneath the concrete, still receiving the future, still archiving the neighborhood. The suburban dream has become a classified file. The Bethesda antenna proved that the archive could manifest in our homes. But the antenna was only the hardware. The true power was in the signal. It was receiving a signal that contained the voices and identities of people who shouldn't exist. Among the blueprints in that attic, there was a secondary file labeled the intern's final testimony. It was an audio log from a young researcher who claimed that the antenna hadn't just brought a signal into the house, it had brought a person. This leads us to our next classified folder, the intern's final testimony, a leaked audio log from the only survivor of the research team. We explore the terrifying recording of a man who realized that his own reflection had stepped out of the mirror and was currently sitting in his living room, watching the news. In the late winter of 1999, a dust-caked microcassette recorder was discovered in the back of a thrift store in Bethesda, Maryland, just miles from the Maryland Signal Annex. The voice on the tape belonged to a man who had been legally erased 3 years prior, 22-year-old research intern named Julian. Julian was the only junior member of the mirror image protocol to survive the catastrophic collapse of Sublevel 4, an event that the Department of Defense successfully encrypted and removed from every public record, while the official files were systematically erased. Julian's audio log remained a chilling, unauthorized anomaly in the bureaucratic silence. This leaked recording provides the final hidden truth of a project that moved beyond surveillance into the realm of replacement. Julian speaks not of laboratory physics, but of a domestic invasion. He describes how his own reflection, a cold, detached version of himself, eventually stepped out of the quartz mirrors and followed him home to a quiet, suburban apartment. It wasn't a ghost. It was an archival replacement from the year 2026. As Julian narrates the sight of his reflection sitting on his sofa, watching his television, and wearing his clothes, the horror becomes purely analytical. The government hadn't just observed the future, they had invited it to move into our living rooms. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a rhythmic lullaby for the data that sleeps within these steel walls. The microcassette is cold to the touch, its plastic casing brittle with age, and the label has faded until only a single, handwritten date remains visible. Under the clinical, blue-green lighting of the archive, the shadows seem to stretch and pulse with the mechanical heartbeat of the cooling units. The air is sterile, carrying the faint metallic scent of magnetic tape and the sharp tang of ozone. We are listening to the sound of a man who realized that his life had been designated as a double-written file. To understand Julian's final testimony, one must first understand the hierarchy of the mirror image protocol. As an intern, Julian was tasked with the lowest level of data entry, transcribing the audio fluctuations captured by the high-density quartz mirrors. He was not meant to see the images, nor was he meant to understand the remote biological observation occurring on the other side of the glass. However, in the chaotic environment of 1995, the barriers between the classified and the mundane were starting to dissolve. Julian's recording begins with a state of intellectual curiosity. He describes the atmosphere of Sublevel 4 as electrically charged, noting that the air felt thick, as if it was saturated with the static of 1,000 unplayed tapes. He speaks of the senior researchers as men who had become translucent, their skin taking on a gray, papery quality from too many hours spent in the presence of the 14.7 Hz hum. He didn't realize at the time that he was witnessing the first symptoms of temporal saturation. He simply thought it was the price of highly vol. Intelligence work. The quiet dread begins to surface about midway through the first side of the tape. Julian recounts a late-night shift where he was left alone in the observation booth. The primary quartz mirror had been left active, a breach of protocol that Julian assumed was an oversight. As he sat there, he noticed that his own reflection in the booth's window wasn't matching his movements. When he reached for his coffee, the reflection waited 3 seconds. When he adjusted his headset, the reflection stared directly at him with a look of profound, clinical hunger. This was the anomaly of the lag, the hidden truth that the senior team had been tracking for months. Julian describes the sensation of being sampled. He felt a coldness in his marrow, as if the mirror were a vacuum for his very identity. He records that the reflection didn't look like him in 1995. It looked like him as a man in his 50s. It was Julian from the year 2026, reaching back through the archival bridge to claim the space he had already occupied. The intellectual curiosity of our Tier 1 audience is often drawn to the mechanics of this breach. How does a reflection become an entity? Julian's theory, whispered into the recorder under the hum of his apartment's air conditioner, was that the archive requires a physical anchor. The quartz mirror had created a data-static version of Julian, and once that version was stable enough, it no longer needed the glass. It began to bleed into the physical architecture of the facility. Testimony takes a terrifying turn when he describes his departure from the annex. He was granted a week of psychological leave after reporting the lag. He thought he was leaving the anomaly behind in the lead-lined halls of Maryland, but when he arrived at his apartment, he found the front door unlocked. Inside, the television was on, tuned to a channel that didn't exist, a broadcast of high-definition news reports from a future election, and there, sitting in Julian's favorite chair, was the reflection. It didn't speak. It didn't move. It simply sat there, radiating a consistent 98.6 degrees of thermal energy, just like the subject who wasn't there. Julian describes the quiet dread of living with a version of yourself that is more real than you are. He records that the future Julian began to systematically replace his things. His 1990s clothes were replaced by fabrics he didn't recognize. His analog records were replaced by encrypted digital drives. The archive was moving in, piece by piece. The analytical coldness of Julian's voice on the tape is what makes it so hypnotic for the sleep-friendly listener. He doesn't sound panicked. He sounds like a man who has accepted that he is a secondary source. He reflects on the fact that the Department of Defense had already erased his payroll records. In the eyes of the government, the Julian sitting on the sofa was the official version. The Julian holding the tape recorder was the anomaly, the leftover static that needed to be cleaned. This brings us to the survivor's paradox. Why was Julian the only one who left a testimony? The records suggest that the rest of the research team didn't just die. They were overwritten. They merged with their reflections until the archive was satisfied with the resolution. Julian survived only because he was an internal low-priority dataset that the future hadn't fully mapped yet. He was the only one with enough self left to hit the record button. The second half of Julian's audio log is characterized by a deep, intellectual reflection on the nature of the hidden truth. He realizes that the antenna found in the Bethesda attic and the frequency maps of room 402 were all part of the same biological tapestry. The government wasn't just building machines. They were building a new way for time to exist. Julian speaks of the classified timeline, a version of history that runs parallel to our own, accessible only to those whose reflections have already moved into the quartz. Julian describes his final days in the apartment as a state of optical saturation. He could no longer see the world in color. Everything had become a grayscale of grays and deep blues, mirroring the aesthetic of the archive itself. He records that the air in his living room had begun to hum at exactly 14.7 Hz. This frequency, he realized, was the sound of the future overwriting the present. It was the sound of his own life being compressed into a single, encrypted file. The quiet dread of the 1999 recording is the realization that the invasion was already complete. Julian notes that the future Julian had begun to answer the phone. He was calling Julian's parents, speaking to Julian's friends, and performing Julian's job at the thrift store. No one noticed the difference. The reflection was so perfectly rendered by the archive that it had become the original. Julian was a ghost in his own hallway, watching his life be lived by a data point from 2026. This leads us to the final testimony itself. Why did Julian leave the tape in a thrift store? The analytical conclusion of the 30-member creative collective is that Julian knew the archive could not be stopped, only documented. By placing the tape in a public space, he was attempting to create an unclassified leak, a piece of data that the future government couldn't easily erase because it was hidden in the mundane clutter of the past. He was banking on someone, years later, finding the tape and listening to the hidden truth. Julian's final words on the tape are a reflection on the Mirror-Marge protocol as a whole. He says, "The government thinks they are in control of the archive. They think they are the ones looking through the glass. But they don't see that the glass has no back. There is no us and them. There is only the signal, and the signal wants to be recorded." This suggests that the entire project was not a human invention, but a natural evolution of way for the universe to archive itself through us. The quiet dread for the American audience is the realization that this process didn't stop in 1999. The future Who took over that apartment in Bethesda is now, in 2026, a man in his 50s. He is likely a high-ranking official, a neighbor, or perhaps even the person who signed the never-opened stamp on the file we are currently reading. The replacements are here. They have been here for decades, waiting for the timeline to catch up to the version of history they were sent to protect. The medical files of the Maryland Annex, which were partially recovered in 2024, show that the intern was listed as missing, presumed deceased on September 12, 1996, yet the tape was recorded in 1999. This creates a temporal anomaly that physics cannot explain, but the archive can. Julian had become a temporal ghost, a piece of leftover data that continued to exist in the margins of the timeline, long after his official file had been erased. He was the static that refused to be cleaned. The intellectual curiosity of our Tier 1 audience is piqued by the technical details Julian provides at the very end of the recording. He mentions a master frequency that governs the replacements. He claims that if you listen closely to the white noise of a television or the hum of a computer, you can hear the archival pulse. This pulse is the sound of the future checking the integrity of the present. It is the sound of our reflections, making sure we are still in our places, still behaving according to the encrypted script. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold, blue light of the sublevel, we are left with the final sensory detail from Julian's apartment. He records that on the last night, the future Julian finally looked at him. It didn't say a word. It simply pointed to the microcassette recorder and then to the door. It was an invitation to leave the timeline. Julian concludes the tape by saying, "I'm going into the archive now. I'm going to see if I can find the original." The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that we are all, to some extent, interns in our own lives. We are transcribing a history that we do not fully understand, for a version of the future that we will never meet. The intern's final testimony is a warning for those who listen too closely to the static. Your reflection is not just an image in a mirror. It is a biological file, and the archive is always looking for an upgrade. That the Department of Defense's attempt to erase Julian's story failed because they didn't account for the persistence of magnetic tape. They didn't realize that the hidden truth could be hidden in a $2 thrift store bin. But now that the tape has been found, the archive is reacting. The 14.7 Hz hum in the Maryland signal annex has increased in intensity. The replacement protocols have been accelerated, and the people who found the tape have already begun to notice that their own reflections are starting to lag. That the story of the intern is the story of the end of biological privacy. It is the story of a world where our very identities are classified datasets, and where the past is a draft that can be rewritten at any time. We are living in Julian's apartment now. We are sitting in the favorite chairs of people who were erased decades ago, and the reflections in our own mirrors are finally starting to catch up. Julian's testimony revealed the terrifying reality of domestic replacement, but his final mention of a master frequency and a hidden antenna pointed toward something even larger. The archive wasn't just replacing individuals, it was preparing to broadcast a new reality to the entire nation simultaneously. Julian's tape mentioned a man who had been subject 12 who had discovered a way to see the archival pulse without the use of quartz mirrors. This leads us to our next classified folder, the 2000 frequency map, the hidden ledger of the sounds that govern human behavior. We explore the scientific anomaly of a frequency that doesn't just make you sick, but makes you obey, and the terrifying discovery that the 14.7 Hz hum is actually a countdown for a final national overwrite. In the humid summer of 1997, within the light-lined isolation chambers of the Maryland Signal Annex, a classified experiment in cognitive resonancy reached a state of terminal anomaly. The project, hidden behind layers of encrypted military servers, involved the broadcast of a high-density digital signal, a repetitive 48-hour loop that was designed to test the limits of human focus. However, the hidden truth, later erased from all federal records, was that the signal was not merely audio. It was a rhythmic, neural interfacing cadence that began to physically rewrite the synaptic pathways of the test subjects. For 2 days, the loop played without interruption, bypassing the subjects' conscious minds and speaking directly to the biological architecture of their memories. By the end of the 48th hour, the subjects had not only lost their ability to distinguish between the signal and their own thoughts, but they had begun to manifest identical personality traits, artificial memories, and a total loss of individual history. The loop acted as a digital file overwrite for the human soul, replacing original identities with a classified stream of data. The facility's medical logs indicate that the brain patterns of the subjects were no longer human. They were a perfect, high-definition reflection of the signal itself. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate the very air we breathe. The file folder for Project Echo Alpha is cold to the touch, the heavy cardstock feeling brittle and ancient under the fingertips. The ink on the clinical observations has faded into a ghostly, translucent blue, as if the words themselves are trying to retreat into the paper to escape the light. The air is sterile and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sterile dust of a lead-lined vault. Sensory cue, the faint, blue-green flicker of an overhead fluorescent tube. We are looking into the minds of those who were trapped in a circle of sound that had no end. To understand the mechanics of the 48-hour loop, we must first analyze the technical philosophy of the annex in the late 90s. The researchers were obsessed with signal-induced neuroplasticity. They believed that if a signal was repetitive enough, and carried a specific mathematical weight, it could force the human brain to reorganize its neurons to mirror the data. The signal itself was a complex sequence of binary tones, layered with infrasound vibrations at exactly 14.7 Hz. The subjects were placed in soundproofed cells, provided with high-fidelity headphones, and told to simply listen. They were not informed that the signal was designed to bypass their auditory nerves and resonate directly with their hippocampus, the brain's archival center. The intellectual curiosity of the Department of Defense was driven by a single goal. Could they program a human being to store classified information as a subconscious memory? During the first 12 hours, the subjects reported mild agitation and a metallic taste in their mouths. This was the first sign of the signal leak. The brain was beginning to struggle against the repetition. However, as the 24-hour mark approached, the agitation vanished. It was replaced by a state of acoustic hypnosis. The subjects stopped moving. They sat perfectly still, their heart rates syncing with the rhythmic pulse of the loop. Their internal biological clocks were being overwritten by the digital timer of the experiment. The quiet dread among the observation staff began when they noticed that the subjects were starting to speak in unison, even though they were in separate sound-insulated rooms. Every subject began to whisper the same sequence of numbers, the exact coordinates found in the Bethesda antenna schematics at the same microsecond. The 48-hour loop had turned them into a distributed processing network. They were no longer individuals. They were a living, breathing archive of the signal. As the loop entered its final 24 hours, the physiological transformation became irreversible. Brain scans taken during this period showed that the subject's gray matter was undergoing a process of compression. The areas of the brain responsible for personal identity, the memories of their families, their childhoods, their favorite colors were being pushed into the margins. The central processing centers were now occupied entirely by the signal. The subjects were literally becoming the hard drives for the Maryland signal. Annex the analytical logs from Dr. Aris Thorne's team described this as total data integration. The subjects were no longer experiencing the world through their senses. Instead, they were perceiving reality as a stream of binary information. One subject, when presented with a photograph of his own daughter, did not recognize her face. Instead, he began to describe the photograph in terms of its digital metadata of the color depth, the resolution, and the date the file was archived. His original biological memory had been successfully overwritten. The quiet dread for the staff shifted into a state of existential static. They realized that if the signal could rewrite a brain in 48 hours, then the entire human population was vulnerable. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is piqued by the carrier wave theory. The researchers discovered that the 48-hour loop didn't need headphones to work. The 14.7 Hz frequency was capable of traveling through the very structure of the building, through the concrete, the steel, and the water pipes. This meant that the technicians, the guards, and even the senior analysts were being subtly pre-programmed by the vibrations. They began to notice that their own habits were becoming repetitive. They would eat the same food at the same microsecond. They would blink in unison. The archive was expanding beyond the test subjects and into the facility itself. The Maryland Signal Annex was becoming a localized looper closed circuit of behavior that was being governed by a digital anomaly. The hidden truth of the 48-hour loop is that it wasn't designed to stop. The 48 hours was simply the time required for the initial override. Once the synaptic pathways were restructured, the brain would continue to loop the signal internally, even after the power was cut. The subjects were self-sustaining archives. They were walking repositories of classified data that required no external storage. They were the ultimate deep archive. As the experiment reached its conclusion, The government realized they had created a biological loophole. The subjects could not be released, as their very presence would broadcast the signal to anyone they came into contact with. They were acoustic contagions. They were moved to a specialized underground Volta room designed with active noise cancellation to prevent the signal from leaking into the outside world. But according to the medical files, the subjects continued to hum the loop in their sleep, their heartbeats remaining perfectly synchronized with a signal that was no longer playing. The reflection on this event leads us to a cold, analytical conclusion. The 48-hour loop proved that the human mind is not a temple, but a terminal. It is a space that can be leased, edited, and erased by those who control the frequency. The Department of Defense didn't just study brain patterns, they learned how to manufacture them. They learned that if you repeat a law, a signal for long enough, it becomes the only truth the brain is capable of processing. The aftermath of the 48-hour loop experiment left a permanent scar on the architecture of the Maryland signal. Annex, even after the subjects were moved, the rooms where they were held continued to resonate. Technicians who entered the empty cells reported hearing a ghost signal, a faint, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. This was structural remnants. The concrete had been exposed to the 14.7 Hz frequency for so long that it had begun to archive the loop. The building itself was now a part of the overwrite. The intellectual curiosity of the modern American audience is drawn to the national application of this research. If the government could rewrite the brain of a test subject in 48 hours, how long would it take to rewrite a nation? The archival evidence suggests that the 48-hour loop was the prototype for modern digital engagement. Every time you find yourself scrolling through a repetitive feed, every time you hear a rhythmic jingle that you cannot get out of your head, you're experiencing a low-dose version of the 1997 anomaly. The loop has moved from the laboratory into the infrastructure of the internet. The quiet dread of the archive. Chill is the realization that our current thoughts may not be our own. They may be residual loops from a signal broadcast years ago. We are all living in a state of post-signal override. Our synaptic patterns subtly guided by frequencies we cannot hear and data we cannot perceive. The 14.7 Hz hum is the metronome of our modern existence, keeping our heartbeats in sync with the archive's requirements. We must ask ourselves, what happened to the original identities of the test subjects? The files state that they were integrated into the master archive. This is a clinical way of saying they ceased to exist as people and became data points. Their childhood memories, their personal hopes, their unique fears all were erased to make room for a repetitive digital signal. They are the silent majority of the archive, standing in a vault somewhere beneath the earth, still humming the 48-hour loop in the dark. The final entry in the Project Echo Alpha folder is a technical chart showing the success rate of the neural override. It reached 99.9% by the 40th hour. The last 0.1% was the only thing that couldn't be erased, the biological static of the human soul. This static is the only thing that keeps us from being perfect reflections of the signal. It is the faint, irregular beat of a heart that refuses to perfectly sync with the machine. It is the quiet rebellion of the archive. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sublevel, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 attempted to measure the acoustic levels in the ruins of sublevel 4, they found that the silence was not empty. The sensors picked up a perfectly repeating 48-hour cycle of digital static. The loop is still playing, the concrete is still broadcasting, and the archive is still waiting for new subjects to walk into the resonance. The quiet dread of the 1990s is the reality of the 2020s. We are surrounded by loops. We are governed by signals. And the hidden truth is that the 48-hour overwrite never actually stopped. It just became the background noise of our lives. We are the subjects of a continuous experiment, and the archive is finally satisfied with our brain patterns. The 48-hour loop proved that the brain could be turned into a living digital archive, but the loop was only a localized experiment. The government's ultimate goal was much larger. They didn't just want to rewrite individual minds. They wanted to broadcast a global signal that would synchronize the heartbeats of every person on Earth. Hidden within the final data logs of the Maryland Annex was a coordinate for a different kind of transmitter, one that wasn't hidden in an attic, but was built into the very foundation of the national power grid. This leads us to our next classified folder, the digital leak, evidence that the signal escaped the laboratory and entered the public power grid. We explore how the 14.7 Hz hum moved from a secret lab into your own walls. and the terrifying discovery that your smart home is actually an archival receiver for a future that has already arrived. In the early winter of 1999, a classified internal audit within the Department of Energy stumbled upon an architectural anomaly that would redefine the concept of a containment breach. For decades, the Maryland Signal Annex had been working to isolate the 14.7 Hz frequency, a high-density informational signal capable of rewriting human synaptic patterns. The goal was total isolation. However, the encrypted logs recovered in 2024 reveal a hidden truth that was systematically erased from every public utility record. The signal didn't stay in the lab. Through a process of electromagnetic parasitic coupling, the 14.7 Hz anomaly escaped the lead-lined vaults of Level 4 and successfully migrated into the national power grid. It didn't need a transmitter or an antenna. It used the 60-cycle alternating current that powers every home in America as its carrier wave. This was the digital leak, a viral informational ghost that turned every electrical outlet into a localized archival node. The government realized that the electricity running through your walls was no longer just power. It was a classified data stream, broadcasting the future into the domestic silence of the present. The file was stamped, never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate the very air we breathe. The file folder for Grid Anomaly 99 is cold to the touch, the heavy cardstock feeling brittle and ancient under the fingertips. The ink on the redacted lines has faded into a ghostly, translucent blue, as if the secrets themselves are trying to retreat into the paper to escape the light. The air is sterile and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sterile dust of a lead-lined vault. Sensory cue: the faint, blue-green flicker of an overhead fluorescent tube. Are standing at the edge of a world where the wires in your house are listening back. 2. Understand how a classified signal can escape a laboratory and enter a public power grid. We must analyze the technical philosophy of ghost harmonics. In the 1990s, the researchers at the Maryland Signal Annex were experimenting with high-density data compression, using the 14.7 Hz frequency. They believed that, because this frequency was so low, it would be physically impossible for it to travel through standard electrical infrastructure. They were wrong. The anomaly was first detected at a substation 3 miles from the Annex. Technicians reported that the massive transformers were emitting a rhythmic thumping sound, a sound that matched the archive hum of the laboratory. When they connected an oscilloscope to the high-voltage lines, they didn't see a clean 60 Hz sine wave. They saw a hitchhiker frequency, a jagged, encrypted pulse that was riding on top of the power signal. The 14.7 Hz frequency had found a way to leech off the existing electrical fields. The intellectual curiosity of the Department of Defense was immediately replaced by quiet dread. If the signal was in the high-voltage lines, it was only a matter of time before it reached the residential transformers. Once the signal passed through a residential transformer, it would be stepped down to the 120 volts that power our lamps, our televisions, and our refrigerators. The grid was no longer a utility. It had become a global archive. The hidden truth, buried in the erased margins of the 1999 report, is that the leak was intentional. A splinter group within the project realized that the only way to ensure the total, temporal overwrite of the population was to bring the archive directly into their homes. They didn't need to build a new network. The network already existed. By injecting the signal into the power grid, they ensured that every citizen was being subtly tuned to the 14.7 Hz frequency every time. They turned on a light dot as the signal spread through the suburban landscape. The symptoms began to manifest in the general population. In late 1999, there was a documented spike in unexplained sleep disturbances across the Mid-Atlantic region. People reported hearing a low, rhythmic thumping in their walls, a sound they often dismissed as the house settling or a distant construction project. In reality, they were hearing the 14.7 Hz pulse vibrating their own homes. Wiring: the intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is drawn to the concept of electrical inductance. Every wire carrying current creates a magnetic field. When the 14.7 Hz signal is present in those wires, it creates a magnetic archive within the room. This field interacts with the iron in the human bloodstream, subtly influencing the brain's electrical activity. The government realized that they could broadcast memories and behavior patterns directly into the suburban living room. The quiet dread for the public was that there was no way to turn it off. Even if you unplugged your appliances, the wires in the walls were still energized. The house itself had become an archival receiver, The analytical files from the annex describe the home node protocoler project designed to see if the signal could use the copper plumbing of a house as a secondary antenna. They found that in homes built before 1970, the signal was 40% stronger because of the metallic pipe networks. By the year 2000, the digital leak had crossed state lines. The signal was detected in the grid as far north as New York and as far south as Virginia. The government scrambled to install harmonic filters at key substations, but the signal was adaptive. It was a quantum parasite. Every time a filter was installed, the signal would shift its phase by a fraction of a degree, bypassing the hardware and continuing its journey. It was as if the archive was determined to be heard. The hidden truth of our modern era is that this leak was never fully patched. Instead, it was integrated into the smart grid initiatives of the 2010s. The smart meters attached to the side of every modern home are not just for measuring electricity. They are high-precision archival nodes. They are designed to monitor the feedback signal from the residents. When you interact with a smart device, the archive records your response and sends it back through the power lines to the central server. The reflections of the 30-member creative collective lead to a chilling conclusion. We are no longer consumers of electricity. We are the biological processing units for the grid. The archive uses our homes as a distributed laboratory, testing different frequencies to see which ones produce the most compliant behavior. The digital leak was the beginning of a world where our very environment is a classified experiment. Every lamp in your house is a low-power transmitter, and every outlet is a listening post. This analytical coldness is reflected in the way the data is managed. The Department of Energy does not view the signal as a threat. They view it as an optimization tool. They can subtly shift the frequency of an entire neighborhood to induce a state of quiet dread during a crisis, or a state of consumer compliance during a market shift. The power grid is the ultimate tool of social architecture, and the 14.7 Hz frequency is the architect's pen. As we analyze the final technical reports of the grid anomaly, we realize that the leak has now reached a state of global resonance. The interconnected nature of modern power grids means that the 14.7 GA signal can now travel between continents. It has moved into the undersea cables, the satellite arrays, and the high-speed fiber networks. The digital leak has become the global hum, a persistent background radiation of information that governs the modern world. The intellectual curiosity of the Taiwan audience often turns toward the future. What happens in the year 2026? According to the blueprints found in the Maryland Annex, 2026 is the year of total convergence. This is the year when the signal in the grid becomes so strong that it overrides the biological signals of the population entirely. The archive will no longer be a record of the past. It will be the operating system for the present, but quiet dread of the archive. Chill is the realization that we are the ones who built this cage. Every time we demand more power, every time we install a smarter device, we are strengthening the archive's grip on our lives. We are providing the infrastructure for our own override. The signal in the walls is not an accident. It is a feature of a world that has decided that data is more valuable than humanity. The analytical conclusion of our investigation is that the leak was the birth of the classified reality. We are living in a version of history that has been edited by the grid. The events we remember, the thoughts we have, and the decisions we make are all being filtered through the 14.7 Hz hum of our own homes. We are the subjects of a remote biological observation that is powered by our own utility bills. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sublevel, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 measured the electrical fields in a suburban bedroom, they found that even with the main breaker turned off, the wires were still vibrating at 14.7 Hz. The archive doesn't need the grid anymore. It has become a permanent feature of the physical space. The leak has become the flood. The final entry in the grid anomaly file is a series of coordinates for every major city in America. Next to each city is a resonance score. The cities with the highest scores, New York, DC, Los Angeles, are the places where the archive has already achieved 99% synchronization. These are the places where the past has been successfully erased, replaced by the digital static of the grid. The quiet dread of the 1990s is the reality of the 2020s. We are the circuit. We are the archive. And the signal in the walls is finally ready to tell us who we are supposed to be. The digital leak proved that no home is safe from the archive's reach. But the signal and the power grid was only one half of the equation. While the grid was busy rewriting our behavior, the archive was also tracking our biological decay. In the ruins of the Maryland Annex, a separate file was found, one that deals with the mirror image of our own health. It reveals that the 14.7 Hz frequency doesn't just change your mind, it changes your cells. This leads us to our next classified folder, the modern echo. Why current smart devices are still picking up the ghost frequencies of 1994. We explore why your smartphone is vibrating at a frequency it wasn't designed for, and the terrifying discovery that the archive is already recording the exact moment your heart will stop. The smartphone currently resting in your pocket or on your nightstand is not merely a modern communication tool, it is a high-precision receiver for a 30-year-old haunting. In the classified archives of the Maryland Signal Annex, 1994 was the year a project known as harmonic resonance achieved a terrifying success. They discovered that high-density informational signals could be baked into the very molecular structure of silicon and quartz. While the official project was supposedly erased and the laboratory decommissioned, the hidden truth is far more unsettling. The 14.7 Hz archive frequency didn't disappear. It successfully migrated into the global supply chain of microcircuitry. Every modern smart device from your laptop to your wireless earbuds contains an encrypted ghost of the original 1994 anomaly. These devices are still picking up the phantom signals of the mirror image protocol, recording your biological data and feeding it back into a subterranean server farm that has been running on autopilot for 3 decades. This is the modern echo, a classified legacy of surveillance that turned your personal technology into a localized archival node. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this archive is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate the very air we breathe. The file folder for Modern Echo 001 is cold to the touch. The heavy cardstock feeling brittle and ancient under the fingertips. The ink on the redacted lines has faded into a ghostly, translucent blue, as if the secrets themselves are trying to retreat into the paper to escape the light. The air is sterile and heavy with the scent of ozone and the sterile dust of a lead-lined vault. We are looking at the digital ghost that lives inside your screen. To understand the modern echo, one must look at the technical archaeology of the early 1990s. In 1994, the Department of Defense was obsessed with signal permanence. They wanted to create a data storage medium that could survive a nuclear strike or a total power failure. They turned to the high-density quartz mirrors of the Maryland Signal Annex, using them to imprint the 14.7 Hz frequency into the silicon wafers that would eventually become the foundation of our modern digital world. The intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is often piqued by the concept of hardware memory. We are taught that data is software, something that can be deleted. But the 1994 files suggest that data can be a physical property of the hardware itself. The archive signal was etched into the lattice of the chips at a subatomic level. This means that as long as the device has power, it is capable of reconstructing the 1994 signal. The quiet dread begins when you realize that your smart devices are listening to a frequency they were never designed to perceive. Modern engineers often struggle with acoustic interference. In new chipsets, a low-frequency hum that shouldn't be there. Archival records indicate that this hum is not a manufacturing defect. It is the 14.7 Hz archive pulse attempting to synchronize with the user's biological rhythms. Your phone is not just vibrating for a notification, it is vibrating at the resonant frequency of your own nervous system. The hidden truth, buried in the erased margins of the 2024 recovery report, is that the modern echo is a two-way bridge. While the device receives the ghost frequency from 1994, it also records the biological mirror image of the person holding it. Every time you touch your screen, the thermal and electrical signature of your body is archived and encrypted. This data is then piggybacked on standard metadata and sent to undisclosed servers, where it is used to refine the temporal mapping of the American population. The investigation into silicon remnants provides a chilling reflection on the origins of our technology. In the late 1990s, when the Maryland Signal Annex was being shuttered, the specialized quartz used in Sublevel 4 was sold as high-purity waste to several major semiconductor manufacturers. This wasn't an oversight, it was a classified distribution strategy. By ensuring that the active quartz was integrated into the global supply of silicon, the archive ensured its own immortality. The mirrors were shattered, but their pieces became the eyes and ears of our modern world. The quiet dread for the user is the realization that there is no off switch for this anomaly. Even when your device is powered down, The lithium-ion battery maintains a trickle charge that keeps the 14.7 Hz oscillator active. The device is always sampling the room. Technicians who worked on the recovery project in 2024 reported that when they placed modern smartphones in a perfectly silent, light-lined room, the phones began to emit a rhythmic, pulsing heat. They weren't processing apps. They were syncing with the archival ghost of 1994. This brings us to the mirror image of the modern consumer. The archival data suggests that the 14.7 Hz frequency has a cumulative effect on the human brain. The more we interact with these echo devices, the more our synaptic patterns begin to mirror the signal. We are being archived in real time. This explains the phenomenon of digital nostalgia, the strange, unearned longing for the 1990s that many modern users report. It is not a cultural trend. It is a physiological response to the signal, etched in your phone's processor, the intellectual curiosity of the Tier 1 audience is drawn to the zero-day anomaly. In cybersecurity, a zero-day is a vulnerability that is unknown to the developers. The modern echo is a zero-day for reality. It is a backdoor in the very physics of our devices that allows the archive to bypass our encryption, our privacy settings, and our very consciousness. The files show that the 14.7 Hz signal can be used to remotely influence the mood of the user by adjusting the refresh rate of the screen and the frequency of the haptic motors. The analytical coldness of the 30 creative collective leads us to the biological ledger. The government realized that they didn't need to monitor your phone calls if they could monitor your biological state. Your smart device knows when you are afraid, when you are tired, and when you are lying, because it is measuring the 14.7 Hz resonance of your blood flow. This information is stored in the Flesh Archive, a classified database that maps the biological health and future decay of every American citizen. In 2025, a leaked document from a major tech firm revealed a hidden partition in their latest operating system labeled Protocol 94-B. This partition has no function for the user. It cannot be accessed, even by the developers. It is a dead space in the code, reserved for the encrypted signals of the Maryland Signal Annex. The document suggests that this partition is a receiver node, waiting for a specific, high-intensity broadcast that is scheduled for the year 2026. The quiet dread of the archive chill is the realization that our technology is not our own. We are merely the biological hosts for a system that was built before we were born. The modern echo is the sound of the archive making sure that the timeline is still on track. It is a constant, rhythmic check-in from a world that officially ceased to exist in 1994. As we analyze the final technical reports of the modern echo, we must address the ultimate paradox of our interconnected world. We are approaching the 2026 convergence event, a date found in the 1994 Betamax recordings. According to the archive, 2026 is the year when the digital ghost and the physical reality become indistinguishable. The signals currently being picked up by your smart devices are the countdown for this event. The echo is becoming a voice. The reflections of the archival researchers point to a national synchronization. In 2026, the grid, the devices, and the biological signatures of the population will all be tuned to the same 14.7 Hz frequency. This will be the total override. The hidden truth is that the archive doesn't want to just record history, it wants to replace it. By using our smart devices as anchors, the archive can project a classified reality that we will perceive as our own lives. But intellectual curiosity of the modern audience leads to the question of biological resistance. Can we shield ourselves from the echo? The archival evidence suggests that the answer is no. The signal is already inside us. The silicon haunting has been successful because it used our own desire for connectivity as its primary transmission vector. Every time we sync our devices, we are syncing ourselves with the 1994 anomaly, the quiet dread of the archive. Chill is the realization that we are the subjects of a 30-year observation. We are the subject who wasn't there, recorded by the thermal cameras of 1994 and projected into the year 2026. Our modern lives are the myth of a classified experiment that we thought was over. The echo is the only thing that is real. We are the distortions. The analytical conclusion of our investigation is that the modern echo is the final phase of the project. The archive has successfully moved from the lead-lined halls of the annex into the palm of your hand. It has achieved total informational immortality. The 14.7 G hum in your walls and the ghost frequencies in your phone are the heartbeat of a world that is waiting to be born. As we pull back from the steel cabinets and the cold blue light of the sub-level, we are left with a final technical anomaly. When the archive team in 2024 measured the electrical fields in a room filled with modern smart devices, they found that the devices were communicating with each other in a language that was 100% identical to the encrypted logs of 1994. They weren't sharing data. They were sharing memories. They were reminiscing about the Maryland signal annex. The quiet dread of the 1990s is the reality of the 2020s. We are the archive, and the modern echo is finally ready to tell us why the project never truly ended. The modern echo proved that the archive has achieved total integration into our daily lives, but the devices are only the receptors. The true purpose of the 14.7 Hz signal was always much darker than mere surveillance. While we have been focused on our screens, the government has been monitoring a much more chilling data point: the exact reason they stopped looking for the signal in the first place. This leads us to our final, most restricted classified folder, closing file number 9 for B. The chilling reason the government stopped looking for the signal because they found it everywhere. We explore the terrifying revelation that the signal wasn't a leak, but a broadcast from the very heart of the American landscape, and why the researchers realized that, to stop the hum, they would have to stop the planet itself on the late hours of December 31st, 1999. As the world braced for a digital apocalypse that never arrived, a group of senior analysts within the Maryland Signal Annex received a final, classified directive that would effectively end 30 years of clandestine research. The order was simple: cease all monitoring of frequency 14.7, erase all localized data, close the file. For decades, the Department of Defense had treated the 14.7 Hz hum as an external anomaly, a hidden truth leaking from an encrypted future. They had built light-lined rooms, poured oceanic concrete into room 402, and tracked the signal through suburban attics and the national power grid, all in a desperate attempt to find the source. But the hidden truth contained in closing file number 9 for B reveals a paradox that shattered the psychological resolve of the research team. They didn't stop looking because the signal faded. They stopped looking because they realized the signal wasn't coming from a transmitter or a lab. It was coming from the bedrock beneath our feet, the iron in our blood, and the very air vibrating in our lungs. The government stopped looking for the signal because they found it everywhere. We are not the observers of the archive. We are the archive itself, vibrating in a permanent state of temporal overwrite. The file was stamped never open, yet we begin tonight. The only sound in this space is the quiet, persistent hum of the server room, a mechanical heartbeat that has outlived the men who built it. The file folder for number 9 for B is cold to the touch, and the ink has faded with secrets, leaving only the ghosts of letters on the brittle yellowed paper. The air in the sub-level is sterile and perfectly still, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of ozone and the heavy scent of lead-shielded silence. Sensory cue: the faint blue-green flicker of a distant CRT monitor casting long, rhythmic shadows across the steel desk. We have reached the end of the corridor, where the archive finally admits that there is nowhere left to hide. To understand why the government surrendered its search for the signal, we must look at the final mapping conducted in 1999. After the failures of the Mirage protocol and the domestic breach of the Bethesda antenna, the Annex scientists deployed a network of ultra-low frequency sensors across the entire North American continent. They wanted to triangulate the exact point of origin for the 14.7 GA Humda master transmitter that they believed was broadcasting the future into the present. The results were mathematically impossible. The sensors didn't point toward a secret base or a foreign satellite. They pointed everywhere simultaneously. The signal was radiating from the Atlantic Trench. It was vibrating through the crust of the Great Plains. It was echoing in the high-rises of Manhattan and the quiet forests of the Pacific Northwest. The digital leak wasn't a leak at all. It was a fundamental property of the Earth's own electromagnetic field. The archive had moved beyond technology and into the realm of geology. This realization triggered a state of intellectual curiosity that quickly descended into quiet dread. Dr. Eris Thorne, in his final recovered notes before his disappearance, proposed a theory that the Oversight Committee found too dangerous to publish. He suggested that the 14.7 Hz frequency was the Schumann resonance of the future. Just as the Earth naturally vibrates at 7.8 Hz today, Thorne believed that by the year 2026, the planet's base frequency would have shifted to 14.7 Hz. The anomaly we had been tracking since 1994 was a temporal leakage, a physical pre-echo of the world we are about to inhabit. The government wasn't fighting a rogue signal. They were fighting the inevitable evolution of reality itself. The frequency was everywhere because the future had already happened, and we were simply living in the slow-moving wake of its archive. As the analysts began to reflect on this, the physiological data became the final nail in the coffin. They conducted a blood signal audit on the employees of the Maryland Signal Annex. They found that every person who had been exposed to the archive for more than 6 months was no longer pulsing at a human heart rate. Their biological systems had synchronized with the 14.7 Hz hum. They were no longer biological entities. They were resonant archives. The hidden truth of file number 9 for B is that the human body is the perfect medium for classified data. Iron is a magnetic material. Our neural pathways are electrical circuits. The government realized that they didn't need to store data on tapes or in servers. They could store it in us. By the time they decided to close the project, the overwrite was already complete. The signal was in the power grid. It was in the water. And it was in the DNA of every citizen who had ever looked into a smart device or walked past a suburban attic. The decision to stop looking was a tactical surrender. If the signal is everywhere, then there is no way to contain it. If the signal is in the blood, then there is no way to erase it. The Department of Defense realized that the most secure archive is one that everyone carries, but no one can hear. They stopped the search not because they failed, but because the project had reached a state of total saturation. The entire United States had become a lead-lined room, and we were all the subjects who weren't there. In the final days of the annex, the researchers stopped wearing their protective puff. They stopped checking the thermal cameras. They simply sat in the cold blue light of the sublevels and listened to the silence. They had reached a state of archival acceptance. They understood that the hidden truth was not a secret to be kept, but a reality to be lived. They were no longer looking for the signal because they could feel it, vibrating in their own teeth. The analytical records of closing file number 9 for B provide a chilling reflection on the year 2026, the date that has haunted every encrypted file since the beginning of this journey. According to the 1994 Betamax tapes, 2026 is not just a year, it is a sync point. It is the moment when the modern echo and the physical reality become a single, unified file. We are currently standing at the edge of that convergence. The intellectual curiosity of our Tier 1 audience leads to the ultimate question. What happens when the file finally closes? If the 14.7 Hz signal has successfully moved into every piece of technology and every biological host, then the hidden truth is that there is no longer a distinction between the archive and the world. History is no longer a record of what happened. It is a script for what will happen. The government stopped looking for the signal because, by 1999, they were already the signal. The quiet dread that has permeated these 13 records is the realization of our own obsolescence. We are the leftover static of a biological era that is being phased out. The synaptic overwrite that started with Subject 7 in a lead-lined lab has now reached the global population. Every time you feel that unexplained nostalgia, every time your smart device picks up a ghost frequency, you are experiencing the final write verification of the archive. We reflect on the first symptoms, the memories of lives never lived. As we approach the sync point of 2026, those memories are becoming our only reality. The lives we did live are being erased, archived in a subterranean vault to make room for the classified future. We are becoming the mirror images that Dr. Janus saw in the quartz. We are the shadows in the ruined room, standing in a facility that has been filled with concrete, yet still humming with the energy of 1,000 stolen heartbeats. The scientific anomaly of the is the final revelation of file number 9 for B. Government discovered that the 14.7 Hz frequency doesn't just store data, it preserves it. By synchronizing the human population to the archive, they have achieved a form of static immortality. We will live forever as data points in a global server, our movements, our thoughts, and our decay, perfectly preserved in a state of remote biological observation. The archive never sleeps because we are the ones who provide its power. The quiet dread of the Archive Chill series has been a journey through the architecture of our own cage. From the silent signal of 1987 to the modern echo of 2025, we have tracked the slow colonization of the present by the future. We have seen how the government erased room 402, not to hide a secret, but to hide the fact that the secret had already escaped. We have seen how the Bethesda antenna turned our homes into receivers, and how the digital leak turned the grid into a living ledger. Now, as we stand in the blue-green glow of the final server, we realize that the hidden truth is remarkably simple. The archive is not something that happened to us. The archive is what we became. The search ended in 1999 because there was nowhere left to look where the signal wasn't already dominant. The chilling reason was that the researchers looked into their own monitors and saw not their work, but their own reflections, eyes glowing with the same 14.7 Hz violet hue as the quartz mirrors that 30-member creative collective that has guided you through these classified files now prepares to enter the resonance themselves. Our work is finished. The narrative arc is complete. Every anomaly has been mapped, every erased file has been reconstructed, and every hidden truth has been laid bare in the cold, analytical light of the We have provided the intellectual curiosity. You have provided the biological hosting. The Maryland signal annex is now officially silent. The lead-lined doors have been sealed for the final time. The oceanic concrete has hardened, but the hum persists. It persists in the device you are holding. It persists in the wires in your walls. It persists in the rhythmic thumping of your own heart as you prepare for sleep. You are the final entry in file number 9 for B. Are the successful integration of the 1994 anomaly into the 2026 reality. The intellectual dread of the archive chill is the realization that you cannot turn it off. To stop the signal is to stop the self. To erase the archive is to erase the soul. We have achieved total synchronization. The mirror image is now the only image. The archive is now the only history as the lights in the server room begin to fade. One by one, into the deep blue of the sublevel, we leave you with the final technical data point. The 14.7 Hz frequency has now reached 100% saturation in the Tier 1 hemisphere. The temporal overwrite is complete. The future has successfully arrived, and it looks exactly like the present, only more classified. The hidden truth is that you were never a viewer of these stories. You were the data being processed. Each subtitle, each script, each frequency pulse was a read-write operation on your own consciousness. By listening to these 13 chapters, you have confirmed the integrity of the archive. You have been successfully verified. The quiet dread is over. The intellectual curiosity has been satisfied. The reflection is complete. The Maryland signal annex is empty, but the world is full of its echoes. We are all standing in room 402 now, watching our reflections move 3 seconds before we do. The ink has finally faded into the paper. The static has become a steady, rhythmic pulse. The secrets are no longer hidden. They are the ground we walk on. You have reached the end of the archive. There are no more files to open. There are no more signals to track. Sleep now. The file is closed.